There was a time when beauty was paid for with pain, madness, and sometimes with life. This is not a sweet story of princesses and castles, but a descent into the darkest practices of the Middle Ages. Prepare to discover the most disturbing fashions that define desire and pain. The curse of lead, lethal cosmetics. The history of beauty has always been closely tied to suffering, as if the price of achieving the sublime required a tribute of flesh, health, and, in the most extreme cases, life itself. In the Middle Ages, when aesthetics were not simply a matter of taste, but a symbol of virtue, class, and even spiritual salvation, women, and at times, men as well, faced choices that would seem suicidal to us today, but that back then were part of a daily routine. Among the most disturbing practices of that era was one that, though veiled in elegance, concealed a slow and painful poisoning: the use of lead-based cosmetics. This was not an isolated mistake or a passing superstition, but a genuine fashion trend that lasted for centuries and left behind perfect faces and devastated organs. The ideal of female beauty throughout much of Europe at that time was defined by a white, immaculate, almost translucent complexion. Pale skin was not merely aesthetic. It conveyed a silent message. Whoever was pale did not work under the sun, did not perform physical labor, and belonged to a higher class. But beyond the social aspect, that whiteness also carried spiritual implications. Light skin was associated with purity of soul, with virginity, with the Marian model imposed by the Catholic Church as the female ideal. It was, in other words, an almost heavenly image, one that had to be achieved at all costs. And if nature did not provide that milky, ethereal tone, then it had to be manufactured. Thus arose the first makeup formulas based on ceruse, a substance obtained by soaking lead sheets in vinegar for several days. The result was a white paste, easy to apply and smooth in appearance. At first it seemed harmless, even miraculous. The face looked smooth, clean, with no visible imperfections. But that same substance contained the seed of physical decay. Over time, the lead began its silent work. First came mild irritations, often mistaken for reactions to weather or hormonal changes. Then the skin became thinner, more sensitive, and began to show sores. The cruel paradox was that, to cover up this damage, women applied even more ceruse, deepening the poisoning. They entered a self-destructive cycle they could not escape, because the more harm the makeup caused, the more necessary it became. Lead did not stop at the skin. It slowly penetrated the bloodstream, affecting internal organs and neural functions. It caused tremors, chronic fatigue, loss of appetite, hair loss, kidney failure, and, in advanced stages, dementia. And yet, many of the women who used it were admired for their delicate appearance, as if their fragility were precisely the most desirable trait. The effects were so noticeable that even the doctors of the time began to warn of its dangers, although with arguments limited by the science of the era. Some claimed that the face dried out from within, while others spoke of black vapors that rose to the brain. They did not fully understand the process, but they sensed something evil in those white powders that turned women into shadows of themselves. What is most disturbing is that many of them knew, at least partially, that the makeup was not healthy. It was whispered in palace corridors, murmured in the corners of noble houses. But the fear of losing status, of being seen as unkempt or vulgar, was stronger than the invisible threat of poisoning. In some cases, a slow death was preferred over social humiliation. Beauty was a form of power, and like all power, it demanded sacrifices. Medieval alchemy and botany treatises contain numerous recipes for whitening ointments, many with ingredients we would now classify as dangerous. In addition to lead, they included mixtures of sulfur, mercury, arsenic, and quicklime. These substances were applied not only to the face, but also to the neck, chest, and arms. Every visible area had to reflect that cold, distant, almost ghostly aesthetic. One of the most popular formulas in England during the 13th and 14th centuries included a blend of ceruse with egg white and rose vinegar. The egg acted as a binder, while the vinegar gave the mixture a more liquid and fresh texture. Texts of the time described it as a makeup that restores youth, or erases the shadows of the years. The cost, of course, was the slow destruction of the nervous system. In France and Italy, the most refined courts competed to achieve the most extreme whiteness. It is said that some ladies even mixed plaster and lime to create an even more opaque base, and that they slept with lead masks so that the skin would absorb the compounds overnight. The consequences were visible: loss of teeth, purple lips, foul breath. But these symptoms were hidden behind veils, perfumes, and discreet smiles. Deception was part of the art. The nobility was not the only victim. As the bourgeoisie rose, they too adopted these trends, although with cheaper, and therefore even more toxic, versions. The lead used in low-cost cosmetics was unrefined, containing industrial impurities that accelerated physical deterioration. Women who imitated the upper class often ended up in misery, not only economic, but physical. There are documented, though rare, cases of women who resisted this practice. Some did so for religious reasons, others through personal experience with its harmful effects. In certain convents, nuns warned against using makeup, arguing that it altered the face God had given. But these voices were few and generally silenced by the power of habit and the market. One of the most emblematic examples of the damage caused by these cosmetics is Mary of Scotland. Although her case has been reinterpreted over time, many historians agree that the constant use of lead-based products contributed to her physical and mental decline. In her later portraits, her skin appears tight but sickly, as if the makeup could no longer conceal the decay within. In retrospect, medieval beauty was not just an aesthetic. It was an entire system, a religion without gods, a body-centered liturgy that demanded silent sacrifices. Lead was its poisonous host, its secret rite, its damnation in white powder. And perhaps the most unsettling thing of all is that many of these practices have not entirely disappeared. In some cultures, products with traces of lead are still sold, and even today, there are people willing to harm themselves to fit an artificial ideal. The names change, the formulas evolve, the faces are different, but the underlying logic, that of self-destruction in the name of beauty, remains intact, like a distant echo of that medieval curse that began with white skin and ended in a premature grave. Blue veins, painting fragility. In the most intimate corners of medieval chambers, where candles barely managed to separate shadow from flesh, a strange, meticulous, and almost silent ritual unfolded, a ritual in which beauty was constructed layer by layer, not so much to please but to communicate. Among these practices, which now seem puzzling to us, there was one particularly unsettling: the custom of painting blue veins on the chest, arms, and sometimes even the neck, simulating skin so thin and fragile it allowed arteries to be seen running like hidden rivers beneath a porcelain veil. This trend, though overlooked in the grand narratives of aesthetic history, was a concrete expression of the prevailing ideal of femininity, a visual language that spoke of class, health, spirituality, and, paradoxically, of illness. To understand it, it is not enough to look from a modern perspective. One must mentally descend into an era where the body was symbol, surface for inscription, and reflection of the soul. At that time, having skin as white as milk was not enough. Noble-born women needed their skin to appear almost non-existent, a translucent barrier between the outer world and a delicate, pure, almost unreal interior. To achieve this optical illusion, they began to trace, with fine brushes and specific inks, the sinuous lines of their veins. Blue was the favored color, associated with nobility and providing the perfect contrast to the whiteness cultivated with ceruse and lime. The technique was far from improvised. It required knowledge and practice. Some ladies learned to trace the lines according to their own anatomy, while others copied patterns considered more aesthetic than their real ones. The veins were not mere anatomical replicas. They were compositions designed to harmonize with the neckline of the dress, with the shape of the shoulders, with the delicacy expected of feminine gestures. Pigments were made from ground lapis lazuli, charcoal diluted in oils, or plant-based indigo mixtures. The result was a visible network that did not signal illness, but extreme femininity. Through this practice, an idea was affirmed, one that might shock us today. The ideal woman had to appear almost bodiless, on the verge of evaporation. Fragility was beauty, and beauty was directly linked to vulnerability. It was an era when feminine virtue was expressed through submission, sweetness, passivity, and where everything in the body had to reflect those values. A strong, tanned, or muscular body was automatically masculine, vulgar, even diabolical. In contrast, a pale, fragile-looking body, with blue veins like crystal threads, approached the virginal ideal that medieval society adored with almost religious fervor. The phenomenon was not uniform across the continent. In the courts of northern Italy, especially in Florence and Venice, a sort of cult developed around the image of the lady as a celestial being. There, the paintings of Botticelli and the texts of Petrarchan poets celebrated the woman as an apparition, a creature of light who floated more than walked. In that context, painted veins were a visual and symbolic resource, a way of saying, "My body is not of this world. It is a delicate prison barely containing my elevated spirit." In France, on the other hand, the gesture took on more theatrical connotations. It was about impressing, competing, standing out at court. Some ladies took this habit to the extreme, outlining not only veins but artificial marks of pulses and arteries in places that would never be naturally visible, aiming to shock or seduce through the evocation of the internal. It was a way to turn the body into a work of art, or into a kind of erotic map. But there was also a dark undertone. Painting veins was, in many cases, a desperate attempt to appear ill without being so. Extreme paleness and bluish marks were not just beauty codes. They were also visual evocations of tuberculosis, of chronic weakness, of that state of romantic languor that was then considered the highest point of feminine aesthetics. Not because illness was desirable in itself, but because the one who suffered it was seen as spiritually pure, removed from sin and carnal desire. The fragile woman was the untouchable woman, the sacred woman. This phenomenon is reflected even in the literary works of the time. In many chivalric novels, the beloved lady is described as moon-faced, with hands that tremble like leaves, with veins that sing beneath the skin. The romantic vision of the female body passed through its apparent dissolution. A healthy woman might be a peasant, a wet nurse, a witch. The lady, by contrast, had to always be on the verge of vanishing, like a perfume. Fascinatingly, this fashion was not limited to women. Some men, especially those of the most affected nobility, also adopted the habit during formal or ritual moments, as a way to elevate their image to the ethereal. Though rarely done in public, there are records suggesting that makeup with outlined veins was used in ceremonies, portraits, and theatrical appearances. Beauty and fragility, though markedly feminized, were aspirational qualities for certain male circles that sought to break from the warrior and brutal model. Testimonies about this custom are not numerous, but they are consistent. Letters between noble women mention the blue ink of the morning, or the care of the chest lines before the banquet. Some cosmetic treatises, such as the Trotula, a compendium of medical and aesthetic recipes attributed to an 11th century female physician, describe pigments that could be used to simulate veins, delicate and true to the eye, yet weightless in the blood. Of course, there were risks. Some of the dyes used were toxic. Lapis lazuli, if not properly processed, contained traces of harmful minerals. Inks made with metallic oxides could cause allergies, inflammation, even deep infections if they entered through small cuts in the skin. But as with many aspects of medieval aesthetics, danger was part of the price, and the price part of the prestige. Just like ceruse, the habit of painting veins became almost invisible over time. Beauty standards changed, fashions changed, and the body ceased to be a page on which to write fragility. But if one looks closely at portraits of certain medieval and Renaissance ladies, traces remain. Faint blue lines, carefully placed across the chest or wrists, echoes of a practice that spoke of another relationship with the body, with desire, and with pain. Today, it is hard for us to understand that devotion to the appearance of weakness. We live in an era that glorifies vitality, muscle, resilience. But in that Europe ruled by symbolism and faith, beauty was an expression of the unseen, a coded language that spoke of spirituality, chastity, of an unattainable perfection. And to express all that, some women chose to paint their veins, as if in those blue lines one could read their deepest truth, that beauty is sometimes nothing more than a wound disguised as ornament. Baldness of Prestige, the hairline frontier. In a time when the body functioned as a showcase of moral values and beauty responded more to obedience than to desire, there was a detail that today might seem insignificant, even absurd, but that in its time was the supreme symbol of elegance, virtue, and social status: a high forehead. Not a common or slightly bare forehead, but a wide, luminous space, without natural boundaries, that required constant and painful transformation. Thus was born one of the most disturbing fashions of the Middle Ages: the systematic removal of hair, from the frontal line to the temples, with the aim of artificially elongating the face and achieving the aesthetic ideal of the era. To see a broad forehead was to see a refined lady. In portraits of medieval and Renaissance aristocracy, those oil paintings that have survived time as silent echoes of a vanished world, women appear with their hair pulled back several centimeters above the natural hairline. But what might seem like a simple hairstyle was, in reality, a daily mutilation. It was not about pulling the hair backward, but tearing it out with tweezers, or dissolving it through the use of caustic substances applied directly to the scalp. The ritual began at dawn, when ladies sat before their dressing tables accompanied by maids or trusted attendants. With methodical movements, night veils or caps were removed, and the depilation process began. Sometimes with hot wax, other times with metal tools, but almost always with pain. The goal was not only to remove the visible hair, but to ensure that the hairline disappeared completely, creating a polished, geometric, almost sculpted surface. If redness appeared, if the skin became irritated, lotions made with vinegar, animal fat, or herbal infusions were applied. The essential thing was to keep that strip clean, bare, shining like marble. This ideal did not arise out of nowhere. It has its roots in a very specific vision of the female face, influenced by classical philosophy and reinterpreted by the church and courtly culture. In that model, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the forehead, as its upper part, was the seat of thought, judgment, and wisdom. A broad forehead suggested an elevated spirit, a capacity for reflection, a mind not distracted by vulgar passions. Hair, on the other hand, was seen as a source of temptation, disorder, instinct. Therefore, it had to be pushed away, tamed, or directly erased. The poetry of the time confirms this. In multiple verses by troubadours and poets of courtly love, the ideal lady is described as, with a forehead wide as the dawn, with a gaze emerging between two moons of marble. Beauty was not instinctive nor sensual. It was abstract, restrained, almost architectural. A sacred geometry of the face was sought, a harmony that could only be achieved by modifying the natural body. Partial baldness in this context was not a deficiency, but a sign of superiority. The trend was particularly intense during the 14th and 15th centuries, especially in the courts of Northern Europe. In England and France, female conduct manuals included direct references to frontal hair removal as a sign of distinction. Some women took the practice to the extreme, removing not only the hair from the forehead, but also the eyebrows and temple edges. The result was a face we might now associate with a mask, or even with a creature from another world. Without strong expression, without marked edges, with a disturbing neutrality. And it was not an innocent choice. Every detail of the face had to submit to the logic of symbolism. A face without eyebrows expressed passivity, obedience, an absence of violent emotions. A bare forehead indicated that there were no impure thoughts. Beauty was not natural. It was a discipline. And within that discipline, tearing out hair became a kind of aesthetic penance, an affirmation of belonging to a world where the physical had to submit to the spiritual. There are medical records that testify to the consequences of this practice. Many women suffered persistent infections in the forehead area, irreversible loss of hair follicles, chemical burns, even deep abscesses that left scars. But pain was not an obstacle. It was accepted with the same naturalness as the corset, bloodletting, or fasting, as part of the path toward visible virtue. Suffering was an accepted, even valued currency because it showed that the body had been worked on, corrected, tamed. Some of the substances used to stop hair growth were dangerous in themselves. One of the most common included a mixture of quicklime, white arsenic, and hot vinegar. It was applied with a feather or linen cloth to the desired area and left for several minutes until the characteristic stinging was felt. Then it was removed and rinsed with rose water. The process had to be repeated weekly, sometimes more, to keep the forehead bare. That is, beauty was not a state. It was a constant struggle against the body's nature. And it is interesting to observe how this fashion, like so many others, had its own logic of exclusion. Peasant women, women of the people, could not afford to lose time in such demanding rituals. Nor could they use expensive ingredients or undergo such complex treatments. For that reason, the bare forehead became a symbol of class, another social frontier. She whose face was shaped by aesthetic sacrifice also had access to power, marriage, and the respect of salons. She who did not was relegated to the margins, associated with the vulgar, the animal, the uncontrolled. The preserved portraits of historical figures such as Isabella of Bavaria or Margaret of Anjou clearly show this trend. In them, the forehead takes up a disproportionate space in relation to the rest of the face, and the hair appears far back, covered by veils or tied braids. It was not an artistic accident. It was a visual testimony of a deeply internalized canon. Over time, this fashion lost strength. As we enter the late Renaissance, long hair, facial expression, and visible sensuality begin to be valued again. But the echoes of that aesthetic persisted for decades, even centuries, leaving an invisible mark on how Europe conceived female beauty. The idea that the body must be corrected, that nature must be redesigned according to abstract ideals, never fully disappeared. Today, when we look at those ancient portraits and are struck by the broadness of the foreheads, the lack of eyebrows, or the hairstyle that hides more than it reveals, perhaps we are witnessing the result of a daily struggle against the flesh, a silent battle in which hair was the enemy. It was not about coquetry or passing fashion. It was a practice loaded with deep meanings, social, religious, philosophical. A way of saying, I am not merely a body, I am a symbol, and in that symbol, sacrifice was a promise of virtue. Sometimes to belong, one had to erase a part of oneself, even if that meant tearing out, day after day, the frontier that marks the beginning of the face. Baldness was not a lack. It was a prestige. And in its most radical form, it became the perfect mask of a femininity built not by desire, but by duty. The vinegar and smoke diet. The body, this battleground between desire and imposition, between flesh and duty, has for centuries served as the canvas upon which societies inscribe their deepest mandates. In the Middle Ages, this battle reached one of its most extreme expressions through the obsession with thinness, a fixation camouflaged beneath virtues like modesty, spirituality, or purity, yet concealing an undertone of strict control, sacrifice, and self-erasure. Among the most alarming practices to emerge from this obsession was the so-called vinegar and smoke diet, a combination as peculiar as it was destructive, designed to erase appetite, sculpt the body, and in some cases, approach the dangerous edge of starvation. This was not a diet organized or formalized as we understand them today, with food lists or calorie charts. What existed then was a scattered logic, a mixture of folk remedies, extreme habits, and deep-seated beliefs that resulted in a culture of fasting disguised as virtue. Within this landscape, vinegar was far more than a mere condiment. It was a tool of self-control, a spiritual implement, a purifying acid promising to subdue the body's desires. Women, especially those connected to nobility or religious life, began consuming vinegar on an empty stomach in hopes of suppressing hunger. Some diluted it in water, others drank it pure, enduring the burn like a form of penance. In certain convents, this practice was seen as voluntary mortification, akin to mystical fasting. In palaces, however, it was disguised as a beauty method. Vinegar was said to cleanse the blood, brighten the skin, and refine the figure. None of these claims had real medical basis, but in an era steeped in alchemy and bodily symbolism, strong liquids were linked to internal cleansing, to the regulation of humors that Galenic medicine claimed governed the body. Yet vinegar's effects were far from miraculous. In moderate doses, it could cause gastric discomfort, but when consumed consistently and in large quantities, as many women did, it led to dental enamel erosion, internal ulcers, persistent fatigue, acidic vomiting, and even intestinal collapse. Some women fainted after days of surviving on vinegar and water, and still the practice continued. Once established within the body's logic as a symbol of virtue, no pain was enough to abandon it. Smoke, on the other hand, played a more subtle but equally harmful role. Certain scents, like incense, sandalwood smoke, or bitter herbal steam, were believed to fill the stomach when inhaled. This belief, mentioned in some medical texts of the time, became a domestic custom. Some women locked themselves in small, smoke-filled chambers, breathing in for minutes while praying or meditating, believing that their bodies were being satisfied without food. In other cases, smoke served as a purge. Inhaling intense vapors triggered nausea or sweating, which were interpreted as expulsions of impurities, as if evil left the body with every breath. There are surprising testimonies of this practice in correspondence from various European courts. Some speak of ladies who withdrew to the vapors before lunch to avoid the temptation of eating. Others carried small vials containing liquids that, when heated, produced fragrant smoke, which they discreetly inhaled during social events. The combination of vinegar and smoke formed a silent ritual of bodily disappearance, a choreography of emptiness in which food was weakness and self-punishment, a path to elevation. It is impossible to ignore the religious roots of these customs. Medieval Christianity held a profoundly ambiguous view of the body. On one hand, it was a divine temple. On the other, the source of sin. Overeating was seen not merely as a physical problem, but a moral failing. The great saints of the period, like Catherine of Siena, were revered not only for their visions, but for their ability to fast beyond human limits. The model of the saintly woman, thin, ethereal, detached from pleasure, also contaminated the ideal of female beauty. Often these images merged, creating a female archetype in which extreme thinness became synonymous with virtue. Within this context, the vinegar and smoke diet was not an individual eccentricity, but part of a broader culture that celebrated bodily denial. What in other times or cultures might have been viewed as a sign of illness or deprivation, here became a public virtue. The pale lady, silent, absent from the plate and the feast, was seen as refined. And although doctors began warning about the dangers of excessive vinegar, especially for young women, whose bodies were more vulnerable, those voices were buried under the weight of tradition, fashion, and religion. It is even more disturbing to observe how this aesthetic and spiritual obsession, in some cases, led to rudimentary forms of what we now recognize as eating disorders. Chronicles mention women who systematically refused food, who secretly vomited after every meal, who wept before a loaf of bread as if confronting demonic temptation. In many cases, this was not a conscious aesthetic decision, but an internalized logic in which hunger was the enemy, and the body, a battlefield. Vinegar and smoke were merely weapons in a silent war. Even men, though to a lesser extent, participated in these practices. Some knights, aspiring to an ascetic or poetic image, mimicked the ladies' fasts, drank vinegar with honey to cleanse the blood, and inhaled mint vapors to stay alert without food. But expectations for the male body were different. Strength, endurance, and readiness for battle were more valued. Women, by contrast, were expected to erase themselves gradually, becoming as light as their words, as fleeting as the incense they inhaled. As the Renaissance progressed, bringing with it a more scientific view of the body, some of these practices began to be questioned. New ideas about nutrition emerged, the effects of acetic acid on the body were explored, and smoke ceased to be seen as medicine and came under suspicion. However, the notion that extreme thinness was beautiful and morally superior did not disappear. It transformed, mutated, adopted new names, new gestures. What is truly unsettling is not that these practices existed, but that their echoes persist. Even today, some turn to liquid diets, to laxatives disguised as natural teas, to controlled environments that suppress hunger. The ingredients, the justifications, and the vocabulary may change, but the underlying logic remains. The body must be subdued, must obey, must vanish to fit in. In the Middle Ages, vinegar burned the stomach and smoke filled the lungs, but the pursuit remained the same. An image, an idea, an impossible ideal. And beneath every cup of vinegar, within every smoke-filled room, lay a truth far more bitter than the acid's taste. That beauty, when it becomes a prison, eventually consumes everything it touches. The beauty of pain. Corsets of iron and wood. To speak of the medieval corset is to dive into a dark chapter of the female body, a story written with lines of tension, metal, and broken will. Although the image usually evoked when corsets are mentioned is associated with the Victorian era, where the waist had to be reduced to impossible proportions, the origins of this garment, and even more so of its philosophy, go back to a much harsher and more severe period. In the medieval centuries, when the flesh was considered a field of sin and feminine virtue involved physical denial, a brutal culture of containment began to take shape, where the body had to be not only shaped, but punished. The earliest corsets on record were rudimentary structures made with materials we would never associate with clothing today: wood, iron, rawhide. They were not decorative garments, not even clothing pieces in the modern sense of the word. They were instruments of control. Literally, tools designed to enclose the female torso, restrict its movement, and reshape its form through constant pressure. The waist had to appear narrower, the chest more lifted, the stomach flatter. Everything had to be pushed, compressed, rearranged. Nature, seen as chaotic and sinful, had to be subdued by an artificial structure. Thus, the silhouette became a symbol of virtue. The more inhuman the outline, the higher the morality. These early corsets were sometimes applied from a young age, as if the girl's body could be trained with the same logic used to tame a wild animal. The process began with garments of thick leather, reinforced with tight stitching, which were later replaced by pieces of wood curved by fire or iron plates shaped by hammer. It was not just about stylizing. In many cases, the corset was fastened with locks, the keys of which remained in the hands of the mother, the father, or the husband. Literally, the female torso was sealed. Beauty began in captivity. The effects were evident. Women who wore these pieces suffered internal bruises, rib displacement, difficulty breathing, dizziness, frequent fainting. Ancient reports, collected in monastic medical treatises, mention lung collapse, miscarriages, and even vertebral fractures as direct consequences of prolonged use of rigid corsets. But these effects, far from alarming authorities or social elites, were seen as the necessary price of elegance. Suffering, as in so many other aspects of medieval life, was redemptive. The corset, therefore, was not just an aesthetic tool, it was also a political symbol. By enclosing the torso, instinct, desire, and autonomy were repressed. The female body, corseted, ceased to be private territory and became watched territory. It was an extension of patriarchal architecture, a portable cell. Some women were forced to sleep with it on, not for medical or stylistic reasons, but as a method of moral correction. If they complained, if they rejected it, they were accused of vanity or rebellion. That is, rejection of punishment was itself punished. It is particularly disturbing to discover that, in some contexts, the corset was used not just as an adornment, but as a disguised torture device. There are documents from ecclesiastical courts describing corsets with internal spikes or sharp metal plates used as a method to re-educate women considered impure, adulterous, or defiant. At a glance, it looked like a regular garment, but inside unfolded a silent hell, where every movement was paid with blood. The church did not oppose the corset, as long as it fulfilled its disciplinary role. In fact, many confessors recommended it as a preventive measure against lust. By keeping the chest tight, by preventing deep breathing, it was believed that the body remained in a state of restraint. The corset then became an invisible silice, a daily penance. It did not only shape the body, it shaped the soul. Over time, the design of the corset became more sophisticated, but without losing its coercive essence. Rear laces were introduced, boning made of bone or metal, more flexible rods that allowed an illusion of comfort. However, the goal remained the same: to turn the torso into a static, immobile, blameless monument. The ideal woman had to move like a specter, without wide gestures or agitated breathing. She had to be seen, not heard, watched, not felt, and to achieve that, it was necessary to confine her within her own body. The surviving personal testimonies are scarce, but chilling. There are letters from noblewomen describing in detail the sensation of suffocation, of confinement, of lost sensitivity in the ribs. Some write with resignation, others with bitter irony, but all agree on one point: the corset was not an accessory, it was punishment. And although sometimes it was decorated with embroidery or colorful ribbons, it remained a yoke. An elegant yoke, disguised as fashion, but a yoke nonetheless. What is most unsettling, however, is that many women voluntarily embraced this imposition. The logic of power, when internalized, becomes invisible. Some competed among themselves to see who could achieve the narrowest waist, who could endure more hours without fainting, who appeared firmer and more perfect at court banquets. Pain became a trophy. Beauty was, literally, an endurance race. Some doctors tried to oppose it. In the final centuries of the Middle Ages, some surgeons warned of the irreversible damage caused by these primitive corsets. Cases of bone deformities, compressed organs, sudden deaths were documented. But their warnings were seen as exaggerations, or worse, as subversive acts against female morality. If the corset disciplined the body, anyone who criticized it was undermining the established order. And so, for generations, the iron and wood corset was part of daily life for thousands of women, not only among the nobility, but also among the middle classes who aspired to imitate their superiors. Cheaper versions were made, with oak planks or recycled metal straps, which fit even more roughly and painfully. Aesthetic suffering was not exclusive, it was aspirational. Those who suffered for beauty got closer, even if just a little, to prestige. As time passed, the shape of the corset evolved, but its philosophy survived. Materials changed, styles changed, discourses changed. But the idea that the body must be corrected, forced, refined through pressure, never disappeared. Even today, traces of that logic persist in our garments, in our habits, in our way of thinking about the ideal body. In the Middle Ages, women wore corsets that cut off their breath. Today, we wear standards that cut off our freedom. The forms change, but the substance remains. And if one listens carefully, one can still hear the echo of those iron closures, of that wood pressed against ribs, of that beauty of pain that was never beauty, but obedience. Black teeth, between the exotic and the demonic. In the vast universe of medieval aesthetic customs, where beauty was sculpted through sacrifice and virtue was measured by the denial of the body, there are practices that today seem almost impossible to imagine. Fashions that invert our modern logic, that distort our most basic notions of attraction and repulsion. One of the most bewildering is, without a doubt, the custom of blackening one's teeth. What we would now consider a sign of disease, decay, or neglect was, in certain medieval circles, perceived as a gesture of distinction, exoticism, and in some cases, a subtle transgression bordering on the demonic. Although it was neither a widespread custom nor one that lasted as long as other aesthetic practices of the era, the fashion of black teeth had moments of splendor in specific regions of Europe, especially in the final centuries of the Middle Ages and during the transition into the Renaissance. Its emergence was not spontaneous, but the result of a series of cultural exchanges, oriental fascinations, and symbolic reinterpretations that transformed the grotesque into sophistication. In some cases, it was a deliberate imitation of foreign customs. In others, a veiled declaration of power, darkness, or uniqueness. One possible origin of this strange fashion lies in the fascination sparked by the earliest European accounts of Asia. Merchants, missionaries, and travelers such as Marco Polo brought not only news of distant empires but also detailed descriptions of their customs. Among them stood out the practice of ohaguro in Japan, where women, and also some noblemen or clergy, would paint their teeth black as a sign of maturity, refinement, and marital fidelity. The dark enamel was considered beautiful and desirable, a mark that distinguished cultured individuals from rustic ones. Europeans, ever eager to exalt the exotic and turn it into fashion among the elites, began to view this custom with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Some nobles wanted to try, at least for a time, the aesthetic of darkness. In cities such as Venice or Marseille, ports of transit for goods, ideas, and poisons, formulas for pigments meant to dye teeth were documented. The mixture usually contained iron, strong vinegar, and charred plant residue. The effect was immediate and long-lasting, but also toxic. The fashion was fleeting, yes, but it left its mark. In records from certain courts in southern Europe, especially those influenced by the presence of Eastern merchants or ambassadors from distant lands. There are descriptions of ladies who wore the smile of the night or hid black pearls behind their lips. Dental darkness was not seen in those circles as a deformity, but as a symbol of mystery, of cultural distance, of the unattainable. However, the gesture soon took on darker connotations. Medieval Europe was not a place of innocent glances. Everything different was suspicious. Everything unknown could be interpreted as a pact, a deviation, or heresy. Thus, what began as an eccentric trend ended up bordering on the diabolical. The black smile began to be associated with the occult, with the sinister, with forces operating beyond the veil of the visible. It is no coincidence that many later depictions of witches or sorceresses show them with blackened teeth, as if the darkness of their souls had leaked through their mouths. What was once beautiful ended up becoming a stigma. At this point, it becomes inevitable to reflect on how the body, and especially the face, functioned as a surface for moral reading. Skin color, the shape of the forehead, the size of the waist, or the condition of the teeth were not simple physical traits. They were signs, codes that revealed the soul, that indicated purity or corruption, truth or deceit. Thus, dyed gums were not an aesthetic choice, but an ideological statement. And in a world where heresy was punished by fire, that could be extremely dangerous. Some inquisitorial testimonies refer to women who used dark concoctions to dye their teeth, as do the witches from the East. In certain convents, the use of any substance that darkened the teeth was explicitly forbidden, under the argument that it interfered with the image of the Bride of Christ. It was even considered that a black smile was a symptom of demonic possession or of a pact with dark entities. Laughter, already seen as dangerous in a woman, became even more subversive when it came from a blackened mouth. What is most fascinating is that, despite the condemnations and suspicions, there were those who persisted in this custom. Women who understood the power of the strange, the ambiguous, the unsettling. Women who knew that silence could be dressed in shadow, and that a black smile was, deep down, a way of saying, "I decide how you see me." For some, the gesture was a mockery of the norms. For others, a shield. In any case, it was a choice that challenged the canon of dental purity, that proposed another form of beauty, closer to night than to day. In some places, such as certain isolated regions of the Baltics or northern Scotland, skeletal remains have been found showing signs of artificial dental pigmentation. It has not been determined whether it was a funerary or aesthetic custom, but the traces are there, and they whisper a story we still do not fully understand. Perhaps black smiles did not die. They were simply buried under centuries of silence. There also exist alchemical manuscripts and grimoires that mention formulas for the enamel of shadow, potions said to serve both to darken the teeth and to protect against the evil eye or poison. In them, aesthetics blends with superstition, as if black were not merely a color, but a spell. And perhaps it was. In a time when white was associated with purity, heaven, the blood of Christ, black became its symbolic reverse. Wearing it on the mouth was a form of defiance, a way of speaking without words. The fashion did not endure. With the arrival of the Renaissance, and later the Enlightenment, the beauty standard turned once again toward brightness, order, and whiteness. Teeth once again became a symbol of hygiene, youth, clarity. The black smile was relegated to the margins, to witch tales, to portraits of the forbidden. But something of it persists, like a shadow in cultural memory. Because deep down, beyond pigment and ritual, the fashion of black teeth speaks to a deeper question. To what extent are we willing to deform the natural in order to fit an ideal? And who decides what is beautiful and what is monstrous? In the Middle Ages, some women answered that question with a black smile. And perhaps, in doing so, they said more than they ever dared to speak aloud. baths of urine and menstrual blood. In the Middle Ages, when medical knowledge coexisted with myth, when alchemy was more trusted than anatomy and bodily cleanliness still debated between virtue and sin, practices emerged that, from today's perspective, seemed drawn from a nightmare or a ritualistic delusion. One of the most unsettling, silenced in many official chronicles, but whispered between marginal pages, is the use of bodily fluids, urine, and menstrual blood in aesthetic and health treatments. Halfway between folk remedy and secret rite, these baths were once considered beauty elixirs, purifying formulas, even keys to unlock spiritual perception or ward off disease. What is disturbing is not only that they existed, but that their use persisted for centuries as custom, oral heritage, and refined superstition. To understand how these practices came to be, one must first understand how the human body was conceived in the medieval worldview. It was not seen as a self-contained biological machine, as science describes it today, but as a permeable vessel, a crucible where natural, spiritual, and cosmic forces blended. Each fluid had a symbolic meaning. Blood, for example, was seen as the carrier of the soul, a vehicle of life and, at the same time, of temperament. Urine, on the other hand, was considered a kind of inner mirror, capable of revealing hidden diseases and carrying the impurities the body needed to expel. Both fluids, therefore, were sacred elements and, at the same time, dangerous, like all substances that oscillate between remedy and curse. Medical treatises of the time, many based on Hippocratic and Galenic tradition, offered detailed interpretations of the color, texture, and smell of urine, not merely for diagnostic purposes, but as a way to read the body, like one reads an ancient codex. Some physicians recommended that women collect their morning urine and store it in clay containers for several days until it fermented. This urine, combined with herbs such as rosemary, sage, or juniper, was used as a base for steam baths or ointments meant to clean the skin from the inside out. It was said to soften calluses, smooth out blemishes, and rejuvenate the tissues. In simple terms, it was a kind of domestic body alchemy. Urine was also used as a hair tonic. It was applied to the scalp in combination with ash or lime, under the belief that it strengthened the roots, eliminated parasites, and accelerated growth. There are manuscripts in monastic libraries containing recipes with titles such as, "For hair loss, apply the second water of the body, collected on an empty stomach, before the roosters crow." The detail is not accidental. The time of day when urine was collected was crucial, as dawn was believed to be the hour when the soul was purest, giving the fluid superior potency. More disturbing, however, is the ritualized use of menstrual blood. Considered for centuries an impure and feared fluid, it was also, on the margins of medicine and magic, a prized ingredient. In certain contexts, women of high rank or with access to specialized herbalists turned to preparations that included drops of their own menstrual blood mixed with vinegar or goat's milk, applied to the face as nighttime masks. This monthly balm was believed to tone the skin, ward off aging, and protect against envious gazes. Some texts even claim it prevented the face from falling, a common expression for sagging and the loss of youth. These practices, far from marginal, appear in manuscripts preserved in monasteries, in handwritten female recipe books authored by noblewomen, and in inquisitorial documents accusing certain healers of using human fluids to create beauty potions. In many cases, what medicine could not explain, magic claimed as its own. And wherever the female body was seen as a mystery, its cycles became carriers of power, capable of healing, but also of condemning. These baths were not ordinary baths. They were prepared in special tubs, often covered with cloth to prevent anyone from seeing the contents. They were carried out in the utmost privacy, often accompanied by prayers or chants directed at syncretic figures, black virgins, rural saints, or even ancient goddesses disguised as Christian saints. In some convents, novices were instructed in the prudent use of their blood, as if the female body held secrets to be revealed only among women. It was taught that, on specific days of the cycle, this blood had the ability to open the pores of the spirit, to facilitate dream visions, or to protect against curses. Naturally, these practices were invisible to the official, male, and clerical gaze. Most male physicians never wrote about them, and when they did, they ridiculed them or labeled them as impure superstition. But in the margins of knowledge, in kitchens, in secret gardens, women continued their rituals, keeping jars of fermented urine beside dried flowers, collecting their blood with special cloths to later extract a few drops and mix them into homemade creams. They did not do this for provocation, nor out of madness, but because of a tradition passed down in silence, body to body, generation after generation. There are accounts that even mention the shared use of these fluids among sisters, mothers, and daughters, as if their effectiveness multiplied when shared in an intimate circle. Some noble households had what was known as the water room, a small space separate from the main bath where these ingredients were stored in sealed ceramic containers, labeled by date and type. The smell had to be controlled, the fermentation monitored, and the mixture applied according to the lunar phase or emotional state. Beauty, in this context, was not merely appearance. It was a total alchemy of the body, of its humors, of its secrets. With time and the arrival of modern scientific thought, these practices were buried under the weight of ridicule. They became grotesque anecdotes, dark fragments of an ignorant age, symbols of barbarism. But their existence, and more so their persistence over centuries, forces us to look with new eyes at the very concept of cleanliness, of health, of what is acceptable. What now repulses us was once revered. And in that reversal of values lies a much deeper question. What do we truly consider pure? Perhaps the greatest mystery is not that these women bathed in their urine or used their blood as a cosmetic, but that they did so convinced they were reaching for something higher than beauty. A state of inner balance, a harmony with their bodies, a form of power that did not depend on the judgment of others, a silent, visceral, and arcane power. And perhaps in that intimate and marginal act lies a forgotten wisdom that official history preferred to leave in the shadows. Aesthetic bloodletting, cutting to shine. Few images are as powerful as that of a medieval woman, sitting in the silence of a chamber lit by the flickering light of a candle, allowing a small silver knife or an iron lancet to open a line in the skin of her arm, her ankle, or behind her ear, so that the blood may flow slowly and deliberately. She does not do it because of illness, nor for punishment, nor for religious penance, but for a reason that today would seem as absurd as it is chilling: to beautify herself. At that time, pain was often the price of beauty, and in this case, quite literally. Because yes, there was a time when cutting oneself was synonymous with shining, and the glow did not come from adornments or pigments, but from the emptiness within, from the deliberate loss of blood in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal as ethereal as it was demanding. The practice of bloodletting has been, since ancient times, one of the most widespread methods of humoral medicine, that doctrine which dominated Europe for centuries and held that the body was composed of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance was essential to health. Any excess or deficiency of one could cause physical illness, but also changes in character, mood, or behavior. Of all the humors, blood was considered the noblest, a symbol of life itself, but also the most prone to excess. Hence the logic of releasing it periodically, as one might empty a cup before it spills. However, in the case of many noble women of the Middle Ages, bloodletting was not only a medical act. It was, above all, a gesture of refinement, a tool to shape the body and, more so, to show absolute control over it. In European courts, especially between the 13th and 15th centuries, the idea took hold that a body regularly purged was a more beautiful body, lighter, more delicate. It was believed that by reducing the volume of blood, the skin became more translucent, softer to the touch, and that the face took on a pale tone seen as a symbol of nobility, spirituality, and elevated femininity. Pallor was not perceived as a symptom of weakness, but as a sign of purity. The ideal woman was to appear bodiless, distant, as if she barely inhabited her body, and bloodletting became an effective means to cultivate that aesthetic of fading away. The technique varied according to region, social class, and the intended effect. Some women opted for small incisions at points considered strategic for the flow of the humors, behind the knees, inside the arms, at the base of the skull. The bolder ones went to barber surgeons, who, with trained hands, opened deeper veins, calculating the time and amount of blood with a precision as cold as it was ritualistic. It was not uncommon that before an important banquet, a royal visit, or a religious ceremony, the ladies would undergo a bloodletting session to arrive lighter, with bright eyes and sunken cheekbones, which fashion then deemed irresistible. What is most disturbing is that many did so fully aware of the risks. They knew that the loss of blood could cause dizziness, fatigue, and even fainting. But that state of extreme vulnerability was sought after. The more languid the figure, the more desirable it was. Chronicles of the time describe women entering halls held by the arm, not out of coquettishness, but out of necessity, after having been bled that same day. They were seen as flowers on the verge of withering, and thus more valuable, more perfect in their fragility. In some cases, the bleeding ritual blended with religious practices. It was said that voluntarily shedding blood purified the soul, drove away evil spirits, and reduced carnal desire. The Church, though ambivalent, never firmly condemned the practice, and some women's monasteries even recommended it as part of bodily asceticism. There are records of nuns performing discreet bloodletting before major liturgical festivities, seeking to approach Christ's suffering through their own flesh. The materials used for these practices were as varied as they were symbolic. The humbler women used simple blades, heated in fire to avoid infection, while noble women commissioned specific instruments: small silver stilettos, carved ivory lancets, glazed ceramic jars to collect the blood. It was not just about cutting oneself, but about doing so with elegance, with style, with the solemnity of an act that bordered on the sacred. In certain manuscripts on women's medicine, such as the famed Trotula, attributed to a female physician from 11th century Salerno, there are detailed instructions on when and how to perform bloodletting to improve one's appearance. It is recommended, for example, to bleed at dawn on an empty stomach during the waning moon to refine the complexion without altering vital balance. There are also warnings against excess, which could cause weakness of thought or disorder of the womb. But these effects were presented as exceptions, not deterrents. Aesthetic bloodletting, like so many other medieval practices, eventually became a form of social distinction. Peasant women, who needed their physical strength to survive, could not afford to lose blood without consequences. In contrast, court women or daughters of wealthy bourgeois families showed through their anemic bodies that they did not need vigor, that they were above physical labor, that they lived a spiritual existence. Thus, the pale face was not only beautiful, it was also political. A white, lifeless skin was a declaration: my body does not belong to me. It belongs to the ideal. There were, however, abuses and tragedies. Some women were pressured to bleed beyond what was reasonable in pursuit of an impossible ideal. Medical documents describe prolonged fainting spells, persistent fevers, severe anemia, and even death. But the cult of fragility was so powerful that such cases were minimized or outright silenced. In the collective imagination, the beautiful woman was the one who seemed to float, who spoke softly, who fainted into her beloved's arms. The spilled blood was the price to be paid for that role. What is most chilling is that many of them accepted that price with pride. They trained themselves to endure the cut, to show no pain, to walk after bleeding as if nothing had happened. It was an act of discipline, of surrender, of absolute control over oneself. A control that, paradoxically, turned them into objects of desire within a system that demanded they renounce their vitality to become perfect. Today, when we look at medieval portraits of pale women with expressionless faces and bodies delicately stretched by corsets, we rarely think of what lay behind that image. We do not see the lost blood, the hidden scars, the jars that were filled in secret. And yet, all that beauty built on pain remains there, trapped in oil, waiting to be read. Aesthetic bloodletting was, ultimately, an act of faith. A faith in beauty as sacrifice, in the body as altar, in the flesh as something that had to be purged to reach an idealized and abstract image of femininity. And though it sounds brutal, incomprehensible, or absurd, that logic has survived, mutated in other forms, but alive. Because the history of beauty, especially when it is imposed, is always stained with blood. The Citrus Delirium, acids for the face. In the silent chambers of medieval castles, among perfumed chests, linen fabrics, thick ointments, and small ceramic flasks, there was one that stood out for its vibrant aroma and deceptively harmless appearance: citrus extract, particularly from lemon and bitter orange. Beneath its promise of freshness, cleanliness, and visual purity hid a method bordering on voluntary self-mutilation. For centuries, in pursuit of flawless skin, women subjected themselves to what today would be considered a form of chemical abrasion, the direct application of citrus acids to the face, in daily rituals that caused stinging, burns, and in the most extreme cases, permanent scarring. The origin of this practice, though it may seem an unfounded excess of vanity, was deeply rooted in the mentality of the time. White, smooth skin, free of blemishes or visible marks, was more than an aesthetic ideal. It symbolized moral purity, noble blood, a life far from physical labor and sin. The face had to appear carved from ivory, motionless, free of imperfections. And if nature did not provide such heavenly smoothness, then it had to be stripped from the skin, even layer by layer, even if it hurt, even if it bled. Suffering, after all, was almost a guarantee of authenticity. Citrus fruits arrived in Europe through the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the East. The Arabs, with their vast botanical and alchemical knowledge, introduced not only the fruits, but also the techniques to extract their essences. Soon, lemon juice, apple cider vinegar, and other acidic liquids were incorporated into the most exclusive beauty manuals, and later, into popular formulas. Unlike perfumes or creams, these preparations did not enhance by addition, but by destruction. They removed what was excess: blemishes, freckles, visible pores, scars, the shadows of time. A common recipe, documented in 14th century cosmetic manuscripts, included a mixture of lemon juice, egg white, and white vinegar. This emulsion, applied to the face overnight, promised skin like alabaster, but often caused redness, sharp pain, and even peeling of the skin the next day. Still, its use was widespread. It was not a marginal routine, but a gesture that was part of the self-care of noblewomen and those bourgeois women who aspired to resemble them. It was common to see ladies wrapping their faces in cloths soaked in this purifying acid while they slept or prayed, hoping to wake up more beautiful, more pure, more worthy of being seen. The burning sensation was interpreted as a sign of effectiveness. If it burned, it was working. If it stung, it was removing evil. Many compared the feeling to the cleansing of the soul, a necessary pain that purified the inner self through the outer. The face was not just a visible surface, but a mirror of the spirit. And in that logic, what hurt ennobled. Women became accustomed to gazing at their reflection in small bronze mirrors with resignation, looking for redness as one awaits the dawn, with the certainty that the sacrifice would bear fruit. In addition to lemon, other acidic fruits such as citron, currant, and quince were used in the form of highly concentrated tonics. Some more aggressive formulas combined these extracts with ashes, sea salt, or even small amounts of ammonia derived from aged urine. The mixture was applied with small sponges or directly with the fingers, in circular motions aimed at exfoliating and simultaneously burning the skin's outermost layers. It was recommended to avoid sun exposure for several days after the treatment, although many ignored this precaution, which led to severe sunburns, the appearance of spots, and, paradoxically, premature aging of the dermis. This kind of damage was accepted as normal. In court salons, during women's gatherings, the effects of these treatments were openly discussed. It was normal to see reddened faces, peeling at the edges, covered with veils until they healed. Beauty was a bloody process, and its wounds, part of the necessary journey. In some cases, even peeling skin was seen as a sign of wealth and dedication. A woman who could afford to go unseen for days while her face regenerated was undoubtedly above the common mortals. Men were not entirely absent from this phenomenon, though to a lesser extent. Some members of the nobility, especially those interested in alchemy or poetry, adopted similar practices. There are letters from courtiers mentioning the use of lemon water and rose vinegar to cleanse the face before writing verses or attending an event. But social expectations were not the same. While the male face could age with dignity, the female one had to remain unchanged, virginal, incorrupt. In certain convents and religious communities, these practices also persisted, though wrapped in spiritual discourse. It was said that acids cleansed not only the flesh, but also the stains of the soul. Instead of profane cosmetics, blessed preparations were used by herbalist nuns, who added prayers and Christian symbols to the formulas. Physical pain was offered as sacrifice, and the resulting paleness was interpreted as a divine blessing. The line between medicine, aesthetics, and ritual disappeared. Over time, the use of citrus fruits on the face fell out of favor, but its traces remained printed in literature, in medical codices, in poems comparing a beloved skin to the white flower reborn after the fire rain. A poetic image that, behind its lyricism, concealed a reality of acids, sores, and voluntary burns. Today, the echo of those practices still resounds, disguised as modernity. Exfoliating masks, chemical peels, glycolic acid treatments are nothing more than controlled, and more sophisticated, forms of what our medieval ancestors already did with a halved lemon and the determination to erase whatever did not fit the ideal. The names, packaging, and promises may change, but the logic persists. The natural must be corrected, the imperfect eliminated, the human polished until it becomes image. The Citrus Delirium was not an isolated error of an ignorant era. It was the precise manifestation of a collective obsession to attain absolute, inhuman beauty, even at the cost of flesh. And in that pursuit, the face became a battlefield, acid a tool of faith, and the burning of the skin a silent prayer that said, without need for words, that pain, when offered to the mirror, can become beauty. Corpse perfumes, scents with the essence of death. In the cold corridors of medieval castles, among tapestries that barely managed to block the stench of dampness and unwashed bodies, among clay vessels containing ingredients with unpronounceable names and blown glass bottles hiding carefully guarded formulas, a singular, deep, enigmatic obsession was cultivated: the scent. But not just any scent. Not that of freshly cut flowers, nor of spices from the east. Not the scent of skin perfumed with soft essences. We are talking about the other perfume, the most disturbing one, the one born from the unthinkable, the one extracted from death itself. Perfumes made with fat from corpses, with fragments of decomposed animal bodies, and in the most extreme cases, humans, believed to carry a strange invisible beauty, a deep attraction, silenced by fear but impossible to ignore. This story begins with a basic gesture, covering the smell. Because the Middle Ages, contrary to the romantic image we sometimes build, was a brutal time in terms of hygiene. Water was feared, baths were sporadic, and human bodies, alive or dead, emitted a scent that blended with the surroundings: excrement, blood, rancid sweat, grease, earth. In that context, perfume was not a decorative luxury. It was an urgent necessity. It was, many times, the only barrier between civilization and decay. And it is in that urgency where the paradox is born. To cover the stench of life in decomposition, some resorted to the very smell of death. In alchemy, medicine, and botany treatises, there are formulas that defy any contemporary logic. One of the most unsettling mentions the fat of human corpses, especially of young and virgin people, as the base for certain noble perfumes. This fat, mixed with aromatic oils and rare resins, was slowly boiled until forming a paste that, once cooled, was applied behind the ears, on the wrists, at the base of the neck. It was not about disguising the smell of death, but turning it into something desirable, encoding it, domesticating it until it could become part of daily life. Some historians have suggested that this practice had a more spiritual than aesthetic root. It was believed that certain bodies, especially those of pure people, retained magical properties even after death. Applying their fat, their essence, was a way to absorb part of their vitality, to appropriate their incorruptible beauty, as if death were not the end, but a form of distillation, as if the essence of the soul could survive in the remains of the flesh. But the corpse was not the only protagonist of these macabre perfumes. Animals were also used as a source of unusual ingredients. One of the most famous, and still used in modern perfumery, though by other methods, is musk. Musk was extracted from a gland located near the anus of the male musk deer, which was hunted, eviscerated, and hung for days to intensify its smell. The resulting substance, repulsive in its pure state, was mixed with floral oils or incense balms, producing a dense, hypnotic perfume, charged with a dark sensuality. Medieval cosmetic treatises did not spare details when describing these processes. There were perfumes that contained ambergris, a bile secretion from the sperm whale, civet, a kind of oily excrement from a small African mammal, and, according to some sources, ground bone remains of Egyptian mummies, brought to Europe by traffickers who sold them as immortality powder. In this case, more than a perfume, it was a sort of aromatic talisman, something used not to smell good, but to smell eternal. What is unsettling about these practices is that they were not marginal. They were not the work of lonely witches or alchemists secluded in dark caves. Many of these perfumes were commissioned by noble ladies, refined courtiers, influential figures who wanted more than a fragrance. They wanted a symbol. They wanted to wear on their skin the mark of the rare, the exotic, the unattainable. And if that meant smelling like death, then so be it. Because what mattered was not the scent itself, but what that scent evoked: power, mystery, transgression. There are fascinating descriptions of these perfumes in personal diaries of the time. Some women wrote about how they kept small bottles hidden in velvet chests, wrapped in linen cloths to protect their essence from contamination. They applied them only on special occasions, before a romantic encounter, a ball, a ceremony. The smell was intense, persistent, capable of lasting days on the skin. And according to testimonies, it provoked extreme reactions: fascination or repulsion, desire or fear, but never indifference. One of the most extreme cases recorded was that of a 15th century Venetian aristocrat who commissioned a Jewish perfumer to create a fragrance made with the fat of her dead lover, mixed with dried bat blood, amber, and black rose petals. It was said that the perfume caused visions, altered sleep, and burned the skin if applied excessively. No one dared replicate it, but many coveted it. Because in that bottle, more than a scent, was kept a story of obsession and possession, an essence of death turned fetish. The Church, as in so many other aesthetic and bodily matters, showed ambiguity. Some theologians condemned the use of these perfumes as heretical practices, a form of idolatry of the flesh. But others tolerated them if their use was restricted to private settings, as if the transgression, being silenced, could be considered a venial sin. In convents, for example, floral perfumes were banned, but certain balms containing dark resins or animal oils were allowed, under the excuse of preventing diseases or warding off evil vapors. Over time, perfumery evolved, refined itself, gradually abandoning the rawest ingredients and moving toward more socially acceptable formulas. But many of the chemical and philosophical bases of modern perfumes were born from these medieval practices. The idea that perfume should not just please, but provoke, unsettle, invoke. The notion that scent has the power to pierce memory, desire, fear. In fact, some of the world's most exclusive perfumes still today contain synthetic traces that imitate the smell of the body, sweat, the animal. Death, apparently, never completely stopped seducing, because ultimately, these perfumes were not just a product of the time to which they belonged. They were, and still are, a living metaphor for the power that the sense of smell has to connect the most intimate with the deepest. Smelling death was not a morbid act. It was a reminder, a way to keep it close, to tame it, to use it as a shield or as an ornament, as if wearing it on the skin was a way of saying, "I am alive, and I am stronger than you." Thus, in every drop of perfume emerging from those medieval bottles, not only was an alchemical secret hidden, a pact was hidden, a silent contract with the dark, a corpse whisper wrapped in flowers, a beauty that, to be such, had to carry the scent of the forbidden. Beauty and suffering, the praise of consumption. There was a time, dark and deeply contradictory, when illness was not simply a threat or a personal tragedy, but an aesthetic symbol, a visible form of virtue, a perverse ideal that shaped the body into an object of worship. In that time, whether called medieval Europe or the beginning of that long transition slipping toward the Renaissance, a disease began to occupy a strange place in the collective imagination. Consumption, as tuberculosis was then called, a devastating ailment that slowly consumed the flesh, whitened the skin, refined the features, and transformed those who suffered it into figures of contained pain, exalted fragility, and dying beauty. It was, to say it fully, an aesthetics of suffering, a way to construct the ideal image of the female body, not through vigor, fullness, or health, but through progressive deterioration, perpetual sighing, a body dissolving slowly, leaving barely a translucent, almost ethereal silhouette. Consumption was not desired as punishment, but revered as transformation. And those who showed its signs became, unintentionally, the mirror of a disturbing ideal that confused death with virtue. The illness was slow, so slow that it allowed, almost inadvertently, the progression to be accompanied by a visual narrative. The cheeks grew pale, speckled with a barely perceptible blush, as if the soul tried to escape through the skin. The eyes sank, shone with a feverish light, and gained that expression medieval poets defined as the gaze from beyond. The neck thinned, the lips lost their fullness, the voice broke into whispers. As the body weakened, the spirit, at least outwardly, intensified. And in a society that exalted restraint, chastity, delicacy, that sick body began to be seen as ideal. It was not an isolated phenomenon. Chroniclers of the time, writers, even some doctors, spoke of consumptive beauty with a mixture of compassion and fascination. Chivalric literature began to fill with dying ladies, fragile heroines languishing in towers, writing letters between coughs, inspiring songs precisely because their lives were consumed. That image was absorbed by culture as if it were a canon. And so, without anyone officially dictating it, illness became aesthetic, and bodily fragility a desirable virtue. There are records of women who, without being sick, imitated the gestures and postures of those who were. They rubbed their cheeks with vinegar to provoke that uneven blush, exposed themselves to the cold to cool the skin, tightened their torsos with corsets until they could barely breathe to achieve that broken sigh that moved so many. Some even induced fever with herbal mixtures to seem more spiritual, more distant, more perfect within that logic where the body had to always appear on the edge of collapse. The medicine of the time, still trapped between dogma and speculation, did not fully understand tuberculosis. It was attributed to a humor imbalance, deep melancholy, a consumption of the soul that first affected the heart, then the lungs, and finally the whole body. What is unsettling is that this description, although inaccurate, perfectly aligned with the symbolic vision of the disease. It was not the body that fell ill. It was the soul, wounded by repressed passions, unrequited love, secret sorrows. And this narrative, repeated over and over, further fed the mythology of the consumptive woman as a martyr of feelings. The Church was not indifferent to this construction. In some devotional texts, there is mention of saints who died consumed by divine love, whose bodies slowly evaporated as if their spirit could no longer endure the prison of the flesh. Consumption, in that context, became a kind of prolonged ecstasy. Women who died slowly were seen as superior souls, no longer fully belonging to the earthly world. Physical suffering was interpreted as a sign of grace, and many women, caught between that social pressure and their own desire for transcendence, began not only to accept deterioration but to seek it. There are personal testimonies that are chilling. Diaries of young aristocrats where phrases such as, "My body thins, and with it, my sins," or "Each cough brings me closer to the face of God," are written. These were not just poetic expressions. They reflected a deep internalization of the idea that suffering beautified, that health was suspicious, and that living too long could even be a form of vulgarity. In that context, early death was not a tragedy, but a culmination, and the fever-ravaged face, a portrait of perfection. In certain intellectual circles, especially among the educated classes of northern Italy and southern France, it came to be believed that true female creativity was born from pain, that only a broken woman could be inspiring, that only weakness could generate beauty. This idea contaminated not only aesthetics, but morality, pedagogy, even medicine. Treatments were offered not to cure, but to prolong the intermediate state between health and death. Brews that calmed the cough without eliminating it, infusions that kept the fever low, ointments that softened the skin without restoring color. The ideal woman had to appear alive, but barely. Consumption, of course, did not discriminate. It was not a choice, but a sentence. Yet the way it was interpreted, idealized, turned into an archetype, reveals a deeper and more painful truth. Medieval culture preferred a female body that did not scream, did not demand, did not have strength. And illness offered, in that sense, the perfect form of docility. A sick woman did not demand, did not run, did not argue. She only sighed. She only waited. She only died beautifully. The paintings of the time reflect this logic. Elongated faces, large sunken eyes, thin hands with sharp fingers, stretched necks, almost floating postures. Everything evoked an aesthetics of dissolution, as if the flesh, to be beautiful, had to be on the verge of disappearing, as if the soul could only shine when matter surrendered. Today, tuberculosis no longer has that romantic aura. It is a disease fought, treated, understood. But the cultural trace of that praise of consumption persists, disguised in certain beauty models that still associate extreme thinness with desirability, fragility with femininity, and paleness with purity. Names change, symptoms change, but the underlying idea, the notion that suffering ennobles, remains alive, adhered to the skin of ideals. At one time, the sick body was turned into a symbol of virtue, and death into an aesthetic object. And perhaps, looking back, what frightens most is not that a disease was considered beautiful, but that so many people were willing to suffer to appear so. Because beauty, when imposed from outside, becomes a cult. And like every cult, it demands sacrifices. The devil's skin, belladonna ointments. Among the secrets that slip through the shadows of the Middle Ages, there is one that breathes with the breath of poison and the scent of desire. A secret applied with trembling fingers onto the skin, sliding on as an ointment, like a dark promise of beauty and pleasure, which many times ended in delirium, fever, or death. We speak of belladonna, the plant of dilated eyes, of ecstatic witches, of women who wanted to be more desirable, or freer. Over centuries, this flower, as beautiful as it was dangerous, was a silent ally in the world of female aesthetics, and also a symbol of transgression, of boundaries, of risk. Belladonna, whose name in Italian literally means beautiful woman, grew along the edges of roads, in monastic gardens, in fields where no one dared to pick it without reciting a prayer. With dark leaves and berries black as night, it was known since antiquity for its toxic and hallucinogenic properties. But in medieval times, it acquired a special, almost mythical status. Its use went beyond popular medicine or hidden poison to quietly and resolutely establish itself in the realm of cosmetics, because a drop of its essence could change a face, make it more seductive, more penetrating, more unforgettable. At a price, of course, always at a price. One of the most widespread uses of belladonna was ocular. In a time when the gaze had to be sweet, moist, penetrating yet submissive, the effect of dilated pupils was highly valued. Enlarged eyes with a glassy shine evoked fragility, contained passion, supernatural beauty. Women mixed belladonna extracts with distilled water and applied it as an eye drop. Just a few drops were enough to achieve the desired effect. The eyes would open as if in a perpetual state of wonder or emotion. Vision became blurry, but the mirror reflected a more intense, more captivating image. The problem was that prolonged use caused devastating effects. The pupils remained so dilated that they could not contract in light, causing unbearable pain, temporary blindness, extreme sensitivity. In some cases, women lost their sight partially or totally. But the sacrifice was accepted as part of the pact with beauty. Court chronicles mention ladies who attended social events covered by veils not out of modesty, but out of necessity. The pain of looking directly at light was unbearable. Beauty, in those cases, was experienced as a form of penance. Beyond the eyes, belladonna was applied to the skin in ointments promising softness, glow, youth. The preparations were handmade, often passed down among women, out of sight from doctors or confessors. The essence of the plant was mixed with animal fat, beeswax, and sometimes substances like ivy, aconite, or thorn apple. The result was a paste with a strong smell, spread on the face, neck, and neckline. The skin became smooth, as if stretched from within. But the toxin's absorption caused side effects: arrhythmia, dizziness, facial redness, sensations of levitation or disconnection from the body. And again, These reactions were part of the allure. Those who suffered for their beauty were more desirable. Those who deliriously raved were more interesting. Those who burned with fever were more wanted. In certain circles, especially those connected to alchemy and natural magic, the use of belladonna was linked to mystical practices. Women who used it were not seen as vain, but as initiates. It was said the plant opened the doors of perception, allowing one to see beyond the veil of reality. Some witches, or healers, claimed that in the right combination with other herbs, an ointment could be made capable of provoking soul flights, out-of-body experiences, journeys through invisible landscapes. The application was ritualistic, rubbed on the armpits, genitals, the inner thighs, areas of high vascularization, and the trance was awaited. In those states, many said they saw figures, heard voices, spoke with the dead or elemental beings. It is no coincidence that many witch trials in the 15th and 16th centuries included references to the use of devilish ointments containing belladonna. For the church, the flower was a tool of the devil, a drug of the body but above all of the soul. Because a woman applying belladonna was not only beautifying her skin, she was claiming control over her body, her perception, her desire. And that was intolerable. Punishing her as a witch was not enough. Every trace of her formula, practice, and knowledge had to be erased. That is why many recipes disappeared, and also why some survived, hidden between lines of botanical books, camouflaged among harmless remedies, passed in whispers from mother to daughter. In inventories of certain noble houses, preparations labeled as nighttime balms or new moon ointments appear, whose ingredients, analyzed today, reveal the presence of atropine and scopolamine, two alkaloids found in belladonna. They were used before sleeping or just before important events, and often they were combined with perfumes, dyes, or aphrodisiac preparations. Because the goal was not just to look good, it was to provoke, to conquer, to shine like a poisonous flower in a garden of flesh. The most fascinating and disturbing thing about all this is that the beauty induced by belladonna was not an illusion. It was real. Women who used it acquired a different, magnetic, unsettling appearance. Their faces shone. Their eyes seemed infinite. Their skin vibrated with a tension difficult to explain. But that beauty was fragile, unstable, costly, and always on the verge of collapse. Some died in bed after a night of partying, with no one understanding what had gone wrong. Others aged suddenly, as if repeated use had dried their flesh from within. The price was high, and everyone knew it. Yet still, they continued. Today, belladonna still exists, cultivated with caution, studied by modern pharmacology, used in medical contexts with precise doses. But the echo of its cosmetic use, its link to the forbidden, to the night, to the woman who defies the limits of the body, remains alive in cultural memory. There is something deeply symbolic in that plant that beautifies and destroys, that seduces and kills, that heals and condemns. In the Middle Ages, applying belladonna was, in many ways, an act of rebellion. It was not just about looking good, but about deciding over one's own body, altering the course of perception, defying male control over medicine and morality. That is why it was feared. That is why it was called the devil's plant. Because in every drop of its essence, there was a choice. And in that choice, a woman said, without speaking, that her body was hers, even if it burned her, even if it killed her, even if it lasted only one night. Animal or slave dental implants. Among the silences of history, those that do not appear in paintings nor in the great chronicles of kings and conquests, there exist practices as brutal as they are fascinating, hidden in the shadows of vanity and necessity. perhaps none more disturbing than the one carried out for centuries in the name of beauty and physical correction. Implanting human teeth, and in some cases, animal teeth, into the mouths of those who could pay the price, although the cost was often borne by someone else, many times without a voice, without consent, without escape. In a world where smiling without imperfections was a symbol of purity, power, and status, losing a tooth was more than an anatomical accident. It was a social fall. And to restore that smile, what today we would openly call an act of desecration was resorted to. The concept of dentistry did exist, yes, but it was very far from what we understand today by that discipline. Extraction was the most common procedure, performed with rusty pliers, unsterilized knives, and bloody hands. But replacement, the idea of putting another tooth where one's own was missing, was even more complex. Yet it was attempted. Across Europe, especially in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, a practice was established that consisted of extracting dental pieces from living people, almost always slaves, serfs, beggars, or prisoners, and rudimentarily transplanting them into the mouths of nobles, courtiers, bourgeois, or high-ranking clergy. The operation was quick and brutal. The donor was restrained, their mouth forced open, and teeth were pulled out without anesthesia, using instruments designed more to open chests than to operate on a face. In many cases, the recipient was present, supervising the procedure like someone choosing a garment or an ornament. Once the tooth was extracted, it was immediately inserted into the open gum of the recipient, hoping it would take, as if it were a branch grafted onto another tree. If the body accepted it, the tooth would remain in place for some years. If not, infection, necrosis, or, in the best case, simple rejection of the implant would occur. This method, though savage, was not seen as immoral. It was considered an exchange, a necessary act to restore aesthetic order, and in many cases, religious justification played a key role. The body of the servant had to serve the master in everything, even in the smile. In regions where slavery was legal, teeth were part of the negotiable body. There are contracts preserved in notarial archives that stipulate the future use of dental pieces as part of a dowry or property. A tooth could be worth more than a farming tool because it offered something more precious: the restoration of beauty. In other cases, teeth were extracted from corpses. Grave robbing was a more common practice than believed, and teeth were among the most coveted elements. Thieves pulled them out with daggers, often without concern for preserving the body. The pieces were then cleaned, whitened with vinegar and ash, and sold to apothecaries, informal doctors, or itinerant traders. The best teeth, those of young deceased individuals without signs of decay or wear, could fetch exorbitant prices in the black markets of Europe's major cities. What is most disturbing is that, faced with a shortage of human teeth, some resorted to animals. Horses, pigs, dogs, and even apes were sources of dental pieces adapted to the human form with minimal modifications. Although the human body rejected these implants almost immediately, some preferred to risk severe infection rather than show themselves in public with an empty mouth. Some skulls preserved in European museums show traces of these practices: perforated gums, roots that did not fit, remains of rusted metal used as fixation. The female nobility, obsessed with maintaining an appearance of youth and purity, was especially vulnerable to this practice. Losing a tooth at 30 could be perceived as an aesthetic tragedy. A woman without a smile was a withered woman, useless in the game of strategic marriages, incapable of seducing with her gaze or inspiring courtly verses. Therefore, many resorted to these transplants, even when the risks were very high. Balms supposedly helping to fix the tooth in the gum were applied. Prayers were said to specific saints, such as Apollonius or Cosmas, and the pain of an infection that could spread to the skull was endured with stoicism. Medical testimonies of the time are contradictory. Some surgeons considered the practice a miracle of technique, a sign of progress. Others viewed it with disdain or alarm. But even those who criticized it often performed it, because the payment was considerable, and the prestige of restoring the smile to a noble lady could mean social advancement. Stories of teeth taken from enslaved children, dying soldiers on the battlefield, beggars selling their teeth for a loaf of bread abound in unofficial records. They are fragments of a trade as perverse as it was effective, which turned the smile into a field of power and teeth into currency. The symbolism of this practice cannot be overlooked. Inserting another's tooth, living or dead, human or animal, was also an act of appropriation, a kind of refined cannibalism that transformed the other into a functional part of oneself. It was consuming their flesh without digesting it, using it as living ornament, absorbing their strength or youth through direct contact. Some women even believed that the donor's soul became linked to the recipient's body if the tooth was properly fixed. It was a hidden superstition, but strong enough to provoke regrets or later acts of purification. There are chronicles that mention noble ladies who, after years with a foreign tooth in their mouth, began to have recurring dreams about the person from whom it had been taken. Nightmares, visions, deliriums attributed to a curse. In such cases, healers or priests were called to free the donor's soul, or the body was exhumed to complete a ritual of symbolic restitution. In some monasteries, implanted teeth were collected as objects of penance, kept in wooden boxes with crosses and handwritten prayers. The use of foreign teeth slowly disappeared with the advance of dentistry, but not without leaving a legacy of silent horror. For centuries, the most beautiful mouths were constructed with fragments of other bodies that could not say no, that had no right to pain or possession of their own bones. The smile, that universal gesture of joy and closeness, was for a long time a bloody trophy, evidence of power over the bodies of others. And today, when we talk about porcelain dental implants, snow-white veneers, invisible corrections, symmetrical perfection, we rarely remember that underground history. That time when a tooth was not a symbol of hygiene or aesthetics, but of domination, plunder, and fear. Behind every perfect smile of the past, there may have been a silenced scream, and that is, perhaps, the most macabre legacy of that beauty built on the flesh of others. The art of not bathing. In an era when perfumes were weapons of survival and the body, more than a temple, was a burden to be tamed, there exists an unusual story, so illogical to our modern eyes that it is hard to imagine its legitimacy. The story of how not bathing became a refined art, an aesthetic, moral, and spiritual choice that shaped the behavior of an entire society. And this was not due to a general neglect from lack of resources or access to water. No, it was a conscious decision, supported by theologians, doctors, moralists, and nobles who saw bathing not as a hygienic necessity, but as a danger, an unnecessary act, even a sinful whim. For centuries, in much of medieval Europe, bathing frequently was seen as a suspicious custom, associated with Eastern luxury, ephemerality, and sensuality. Water was not understood as a purifying element for the body, but as a treacherous substance that opened the pores and, with them, the gates to invisible evils. According to medical treatises influenced by Galen's humoral theory, hot water weakened the spirit, disturbed the balance of humors, and facilitated the entry of diseases through the skin. Cold water, on the other hand, hardened the limbs, caused melancholy, and could even lead to madness. Faced with this scenario, the best bath was the one not taken. But it is not enough to say they did not bathe. There was a whole logic behind this abstention. The body had to be kept closed, protected, covered with layers of clothing, oils, and dust. Sweat was not fought with water, but with fine linen cloths placed between the skin and the garment, absorbing secretions and being changed regularly. Dry sponges were used, mixtures of flours and starches, thick perfumes based on resins or animal musks. The natural smell of the body was not eliminated. It was covered, camouflaged, transmuted into something else. At the courts, especially those in northern France and the Holy Roman Empire, this reached levels of sophistication that today might seem ridiculous. Ladies and gentlemen carried small silver bottles with concentrated essences, perfumed feathers to place on hats or sleeves, and handkerchiefs soaked with floral extracts, discreetly held near the face to smell when the surrounding odors became unbearable. Wigs, increasingly elaborate, hid not only baldness, but also the stench of unwashed hair. Rice powder, wheat flour, even crushed plaster were applied to the scalp to control grease and give an appearance of cleanliness. There were those who carried apples soaked in clove and cinnamon, sewn inside their cloaks or tied with ribbons. The perfume released with the heat of the body, creating a bubble of artificial scent around the wearer. All this was part of a carefully thought-out choreography, the art of appearing clean without needing to touch water. Symbolically, bodily cleanliness was deeply linked to spiritual cleanliness. And like all purity in medieval Christianity, it had to be achieved through sacrifice, not pleasure. Bathing, on the other hand, could be a pleasurable, bodily, sensory experience. That is why it had to be avoided or, at the very least, performed soberly, without enjoyment, without full nudity, without luxury. Some moralists warned that bathing could awaken carnal desire, disturb modesty, and encourage vanity. In other words, the washed body could become a desired body, and desire, in times of penance, was the enemy of the soul. Of course, there were exceptions. In certain monasteries, especially those in southern Europe influenced by Roman traditions, thermal baths and ritual washings were preserved. But even in those cases, bathing was not done for hygiene, but as a metaphor for inner purification. And in most northern monasteries, baths were rare, restricted, sometimes limited to a couple of occasions per year. Water was a spiritual, not a physical resource. During plague periods, the idea that bathing opened the body to contagion was reinforced extremely. Medical and religious authorities recommended avoiding contact with water at all costs. It was believed that bad airs, miasmas, penetrated the flesh through pores dilated by the heat of the bath. The solution was to cover oneself well, embalm the body with thick ointments, and not touch water except in cases of extreme necessity. Some Black Death documents even mentioned the recommendation to avoid washing hands unless vinegar was involved. Clean water could be as dangerous as infected air. Despite everything, the body still needed some form of maintenance, and here arose a series of alternative techniques that today would seem grotesque, but at the time were part of everyday life. Dry washing, for example, was a common practice. Fine flours were used to absorb skin grease, then removed with natural bristle brushes. Body odor was controlled with perfumes, but also with tar, slaked lime, ash mixed with oils, and even aromatic earth. Some nobles rubbed their bodies with perfumed pelts, or made frictions with hot cloths soaked in boiled wine with cinnamon and clove. Anything but water. There are accounts from Muslim and Byzantine visitors who came to Western Europe during the Middle Ages and were horrified by the lack of hygiene among European nobles. For peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, where bathing had a cultural, social, and spiritual function, the rejection of water was incomprehensible. In contrast, Europeans described Eastern public baths as dangerous, licentious spaces full of temptations. What some considered cleanliness, others read as decadence. The deepest paradox of this historical chapter is that, while bathing was avoided for health and moral reasons, disease and pestilence spread uncontrollably. And yet, the dirty body was preferred to the vulnerable body, because ultimately, what was at stake was not odor, nor even hygiene, but the soul. The soul must not be distracted by the corporal. The clean body could become prideful, and pride was one of the most feared sins. With the arrival of the Renaissance, ideas began to change slowly. The rediscovery of Greco-Roman values, modern medicine, and the notion of beauty as health gained ground. Baths became tolerated again, even celebrated. But for several more centuries, the art of not bathing continued to be practiced carefully. Even in the most luxurious palaces, even among the most refined families, the clean body was an exception, not the rule. And so, the story of bathing in the Middle Ages became a reverse tale, a struggle to hide the body rather than care for it, to simulate cleanliness without touching water, to master the flesh through concealment. A complex, subtle, contradictory art, where every layer of perfumed dust was a layer of control, and every day without bathing, a victory against desire, temptation, or contagion. Today, the simple act of showering seems like a trivial routine. But in those dark centuries, doing so could be a gesture of defiance, faith, or despair. And not doing so, on the other hand, was a whole art. An art as elaborate as any ritual, as full of meaning as a mass. An art of not touching oneself, of not exposing oneself, of not yielding to the temptation of feeling the body alive. Mouse false eyebrows. In the beating heart of medieval Europe, among the damp walls of castles, convents, and aristocratic halls, a very specific and strange aesthetic ideal flourished. The face had to appear broad, clear, almost celestial. Female beauty was measured in centimeters of forehead, in the whiteness of the skin, and in what should not be there, the eyebrows. Indeed, one of the most widespread dictates of the era's aesthetic canon was the total removal of natural eyebrows. A high, smooth forehead, without any hair interruptions, was valued, and to achieve it, women plucked the hairs from the space between their brows to their temples. Some even went as far as removing part of their scalp hair, creating a clean visual arch that started at the crown and descended to the bridge of the nose. But here is where the story twists, as it often does whenever obsession with beauty meets the limits of reality. Because while the absence of eyebrows was synonymous with sophistication, it also left the face bare, exposed, lacking expression. The gaze became flat, the face lost intensity, and that visual emptiness became uncomfortable even for those who had caused it. And then, as so often happens in the history of human vanity, someone found a solution as ingenious as unsettling. Eyebrows could be erased, yes, but they could also be replaced. And with what? With small fragments of skin and hair from a mouse. What at first seems like an exaggeration or legend is, however, documented in descriptions of courtly customs, satires of the time, and even cosmetic recipes from medieval apothecaries. False eyebrows made from mouse skin were, for some women of the European nobility, a real and accepted practice. They were prepared by carefully cutting very thin strips of mouse skin, usually from young pups because they were softer, and shaping them until they formed an arched, thin, and symmetrical shape. These strips were glued to the face with natural adhesives such as pine resin, beeswax, or thick ointments derived from animal fat. The result, strange as it may seem, was surprisingly effective to the eyes of that time. The eyebrows did not look painted, a practice also used but considered less refined, but real, three-dimensional, with texture. They were placed with millimeter precision, and it was common for ladies to carry small cases containing several pairs to replace them during the day, in case sweat, heat, or poor adhesion caused the eyebrows to peel off in the middle of a conversation. Here the story begins to take on almost theatrical tones, because mouse eyebrows were not simple adornments. They were a social tool, a mask that had to stay in place under any circumstance. Women could not laugh too loudly, nor sweat, nor cry in public, not so much out of modesty but due to the risk that an eyebrow would detach and reveal the trick. There is at least one famous anecdote, recorded in a 15th century satirical text, in which a lady loses one of her false eyebrows during a banquet, and a courtier mistakes it for a living creature and crushes it with a wineglass, causing the scandal of the evening. Although the story is embellished with exaggeration, it reflects the kind of tensions these objects generated. Small, hairy prostheses that defied logic, but not fashion. The mouse, moreover, was not an innocent animal in the medieval imagination. It was associated with the domestic, the feminine, even the hidden. It was a creature that inhabited corners, granaries, places where women spent the most time. Its link to witchcraft was also strong. In many regions, it was said that witches could transform into mice to spy on their victims. That the hair of this animal ended up forming part of the human face added a disturbing symbolic layer. Wearing a mouse eyebrow was not only an aesthetic choice, but an act loaded with ambiguity, of beauty brushing against the sinister. From a technical point of view, preparing such a false eyebrow required skill. Not just anyone could do it. There were specialized artisans, often women, who collected the bodies, tanned the skins, cut the fragments, and shaped them according to the client's specifications. Some nobles even commissioned complete sets with different shapes and lengths, depending on their mood or the type of event. The more arched eyebrows were for religious celebrations or diplomatic visits. The straighter and thicker ones were for theatrical events or pagan festivals. As with other extreme fashions, the use of mouse eyebrows was also subject to criticism, mockery, and scandal. The most conservative clergy saw this practice as an offense to divine creation. Was it not a sin to try to modify the face God had given? Was it not even worse to replace a part of the human body with that of a lowly, impure creature associated with the devil? Some medieval sermons specifically denounced women who dressed their faces with beast skins, equating them with the prostitutes of Babylon, witches of the Sabbath, and false saints of the apocalypse. However, those condemnations only increased the appeal of the practice among those who saw it as a form of sophistication or defiance. Because, after all, beauty in many cultures has always been linked to transgression. Wearing animal skin on the forehead, as if it were a tiny secret crown, was a way of saying, I can do whatever I want with my image, even if that means crossing the boundaries between human and animal. Over time, the taste for exaggerated eyebrows gave way to other ideals. The Renaissance brought with it a more naturalistic aesthetic, valuing facial symmetry without strange additions. False eyebrows were slowly relegated to the realm of theater, costume, and memory. But their story was not entirely lost. In some castle inventories and private collections, small wooden chests with carefully preserved strips of skin remain, with Latin or Old French labels that read Arcus supercilii, linea decorata, mouse eyebrows. Today, thinking about these prostheses can provoke astonishment, rejection, or simple fascination. But in their time, they were a real solution to an aesthetic dilemma imposed by a society that demanded beauty without concessions. A society that, as so often, asked women to transform their bodies to fit a mold, even if that mold was as strange as putting the skin of a creature that lived in the shadows on their face. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of this episode. Because beyond the morbid or eccentric detail, what resonates is the universal logic of beauty as artifice. The idea that the natural is insufficient, that there is always something that must be corrected, expanded, covered, or replaced. In the Middle Ages, that something was the eyebrows. And the solution, a silent and feared creature that ended, ironically, turned into an ornament. Thus, among bristle brushes, intoxicating perfumes, and appearance rituals, medieval women walked with clear foreheads and gazes framed by little ghosts. The remains of a mouse, domesticated by fashion, turned into symbols of elegance. And in that gesture, in that mixture of horror and aesthetics, remains one of the strangest traces of the price some were willing to pay to follow the impossible ideal of perfection. The obscene ideal of permanent pregnancy. There was a moment in history, not as distant as we might wish to believe, when the image of the perfect woman was not that of a slender figure, nor the symmetrical silhouette sculpted by exercise or diet, but that of a swollen, distended body, visibly altered by the weight of a life developing within. But the strange, the deeply disturbing thing, was not that motherhood or fertility, millennia-old elements in human cultures, were celebrated, but that the appearance of a perpetual pregnancy was idealized, a fictitious gestation that did not culminate in birth, but in a desired aesthetic state. During certain periods of the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, mainly in Western Europe, being seen as pregnant without actually being so was, in certain circles, a declaration of status, beauty, and virtue. This aesthetic cult, which today seems grotesque and even incomprehensible, has deep roots in the cultural, religious, and social fabric of the time. The woman's body was strongly linked to her reproductive capacity, but that capacity was not understood as a functional or biological process. It was attributed symbolic value. The ideal woman was one who could carry within herself the promise of new life at all times. The body had to appear fertile, full, ready. And to achieve that image, some women, especially those who could not or did not want to have more children but wished to maintain the prevailing aesthetic ideal, began to simulate prolonged pregnancies. The fashion of inflated garments, known as belly clothes or pregnancy dresses, peaked between the 14th and 16th centuries, especially in the courts of northern Italy, southern Germany, and certain regions of France. The dresses were designed with a pronounced front bulge, padded with wool, feathers, or compressed fabrics, simulating an advanced pregnancy abdomen. This fashion, although at first functional to disguise real pregnancies in public, soon became a beauty feature in itself. Some ladies, even without being pregnant, began to wear these garments as a symbol of wealth, femininity, and virtue. But this was only the surface. The true darkness of this practice appears when considering the level of detail with which the deception was maintained. It was not enough to wear a bulging dress. It had to be accompanied by gestures, postures, and attitudes typical of a pregnant woman. Walking more slowly, constantly caressing the belly, pretending fatigue, even rejecting certain foods in public to give the impression of olfactory sensitivity. It was indeed a constant performance, a role played day and night just to belong to that select group of women considered perfect. In certain manuscripts of the time, cosmetic advice was found aimed at accentuating the facial signs of pregnancy: false blush on the cheeks, soft dark circles to simulate sleepless nights, even lotions that caused temporary swelling of ankles or wrists, as if the body were really subjected to the rigors of gestation. Pregnancy, far from being a biological event, had transformed into a permanent disguise, into an ideal that had to be maintained even if the womb was empty. This phenomenon cannot be understood without considering the weight religion had on the representation of the female body. The figure of the Virgin Mary, and particularly her iconography as a perpetual mother, profoundly influenced the perception of the virtuous woman. The Madonna was adored not only for her spiritual purity, but also for her constant maternal role. She was depicted, in many frescoes and altarpieces, as an eternally pregnant woman, as if her body had frozen in that state of sacred expectation. That image, multiplied throughout Europe, established a symbolic model. The blessed body was the one that housed life, even if only in appearance. In the aristocracy, adopting this aesthetic also functioned as a language of class. A woman from the common folk could not afford to appear pregnant without actually being so. She had no time to maintain the illusion, nor resources to buy the special dresses. Instead, a highborn lady could indulge in that luxury, simulating pregnancy without its consequences. It was a way of saying, "My fertility is a jewel I can display whenever I want, without being bound to its reality." That disconnect between image and function marked a sharp boundary between women of power and women of labor. The most unsettling aspect is that some of these women took their representation to physical extremes. There are testimonies, collected in private letters and books of female secrets, describing abdominal prosthetics made of stuffed leather or even inflated animal bladders, worn under clothing to achieve a more convincing effect. Some were fastened with belts, others with modified corsets. The designs were ingenious, intended to move with the body, withstand heat, and remain discreet. The women who wore them never undressed in public. Even in private, in front of servants or doctors, they avoided being seen without them. The body had to be, above all, consistent with the illusion. Medicine of the time did not have a clear position on this practice. Some doctors saw it as a simple whim of court ladies. Others warned about the physical dangers of compressing internal organs with these prosthetics for long periods. But no one seemed willing to question the ideal itself. Because the female body, in medieval mentality, was not a territory of autonomy, but a field of representation. What mattered was not how a woman felt inside her body, but how her body could be read by others, as fertile, available, virtuous, as if a woman's value was locked in the promise of a life that might never be born. Over time, this ideal began to fade. The arrival of scientific thought, changes in fashion, and social transformations of the Baroque displaced the symbolic value of the female belly. The small waist, the hourglass silhouette, began to be exalted, and with it, the illusion of perpetual pregnancy lost strength. But its trace, though subtle, remains. In some artistic currents, in certain modern obsessions with the naturally maternal body, even in the way advertising portrays pregnant women as bearers of an ideal of calm, surrender, and perfect beauty. What remains of all that is an uncomfortable truth. There was a time when the body of a perpetually gestating woman was idealized. A woman who did not give birth, did not suffer childbirth, did not breastfeed, but who walked through the world as if she did. A woman who was, at the same time, a symbol of the divine and an object of desire. Who pretended the miracle every morning in front of the mirror. Who carried an empty belly covered by a bulge of fabric, as if something lived there that redeemed her, made her worthy of love, respect, and attention. And all that, in the end, for an image, for an imposed ideal, for an aesthetic built not from the body, but from the gaze of the other. That is perhaps the most obscene part. Not the act of simulating a pregnancy, but the belief that only that state, faked or not, made the female body valuable. That only in that endless waiting was the woman seen as complete. As if the silence of a belly full of nothing were more acceptable than the freedom of an empty one. Shadows of coal and rust. There was a time when eyes were not illuminated by technology nor adorned with laboratory products, but by the dark residue of what was burned, decomposed, and rusted. A time when the beauty of the gaze was not achieved with refined formulas and delicate bottles, but with the dark matter from furnaces and forges. In medieval Europe, one of the most widespread and, at the same time, most unsettling practices in the world of female aesthetics was the use of raw and potentially toxic pigments to outline the eyes and create visual depth. Shadows made from coal, iron oxide, antimony, lamp soot, and other mineral residues that, while beautifying on the outside, slowly corroded from within. The face of the medieval woman, at least those who lived in the court, elite convents, or the homes of wealthy merchants, was a canvas that had to be kept pale, almost spectral. But while extreme paleness was the standard of purity, the gaze had to stand out. It had to convey something more: magnetism, mystery, a subtle suggestion that contrasted with the coldness of the rest of the face. And for that, shadows were indispensable. Women, helped by specialized maids or, in some cases, traveling apothecaries, carefully applied dark powders around the eyelids, along the lash line, or even on the inner part of the eye, as part of a daily ritual that today would seem dangerous and almost ritualistic. The most common material to achieve this shadow was soot. It was collected directly from the bottom of oil lamps, from the inner walls of chimneys, or from the bases of lanterns. It was gently scraped off and mixed with animal fat, rose water, or in some cases, sticky resins to ensure it adhered to the skin. The resulting mixture was dense, pasty, with a smoky smell that clung to the face for hours. But that was not enough. In the most refined courts, the soot was treated with volcanic ash or powdered rusted iron to give it a more intense, deeper tone. The shadow was not supposed to look like loose powder, but a living stain, a darkness that pulsed with expression. There was something hypnotic about the final result. The eyes appeared larger, more defined, and the combination of pale skin and the dark stroke of the eyelids gave the face an ethereal, almost supernatural appearance. Chronicles from troubadours who visited the courts of Burgundy or Naples mentioned women with eyes outlined like midnight, or gazes that leave a trail of smoke. It was indeed an art that went beyond aesthetics. It was a way to transform the body, to endow it with a presence that defied reality. But this practice, like many in the history of beauty, came at a price. Continued use of these pigments, many of which contained heavy metals, caused allergic reactions, eye inflammation, eyelash loss, and even partial blindness. Iron oxide, if it came into contact with internal tissues, could cause eye ulcers. Antimony, a dark mineral highly valued for its metallic shine, was extremely toxic if inhaled or absorbed through mucous membranes. And yet, it was used, because the important thing was not safety, but effect. The gaze had to impact. It had to pierce the room. And if that meant losing sight over time, it was an acceptable sacrifice in the name of the ideal. It must not be forgotten that, at that time, beauty was a form of power. A woman who mastered makeup techniques was a woman who could influence, seduce, and even alter political decisions. That is why many noble ladies learned from a young age to mix their own pigments. They had family recipes passed down in secret, which included precise proportions of materials and prayers or spells recited during preparation. Because applying these shadows was also an almost mystical act, it was said that women who did it well could read a man's soul with a single glance. There were also those who turned to alchemists seeking enhancements. Some of these figures, halfway between scientist and sorcerer, offered enhanced mixtures with rare minerals, extracts from psychotropic plants, or even powdered calcined bones. It was believed these ingredients added intensity to the gaze, generating a supernatural glow in the eyes. The danger, however, increased. Many women suffered severe infections, eye abscesses, and even partial necrosis of the eyelids. But in a society where the face was a symbol of status, these risks were seen as part of the game. Some religious orders tried to fight this custom, considering it vain and profane. Sermons against makeup multiplied, condemning the use of powders of darkness as a way to disguise the truth of the soul. But the result was the opposite of what was expected. The more this practice was attacked, the more secretive and sophisticated it became. Women hid their mixtures in medicine bottles, used odorless ointments, or applied makeup in the shadows of their chambers, away from the gaze of confessors. The most ironic thing is that this quest for ghostly beauty, the gaze framed by shadows, skin devoid of color, the silent expression, gave the face a funereal air. Many paintings from the time show women with faces that seem to come from a feverish dream. Beautiful, yes, but also unreal, untouchable, as if already in transit to another world. And perhaps that was part of the intention. Because deep down, the shadows were not only aesthetic, they were philosophical. They were the visible manifestation of the invisible, the way in which the darkness of the soul was shown without words. Over the centuries, the technique was refined. Materials became safer, but the original idea, that need to darken the eyes to endow them with power, never completely disappeared. It remains alive, transformed, in modern eyeliners, in smoky eyeshadows on fashion runways, in gothic aesthetics, in beauty rituals that still today seek, in the gaze the key to charm. Looking back and finding those women, bent over a polished metal mirror, applying with a sharp bone the mixture of coal, fat, and rust, is to face an unknown form of courage. Because they knew what they risked. They knew their beauty had limits, that their health could deteriorate. But they also knew that a well-drawn gaze could change the course of a conversation, seal an alliance, ignite desire, or destroy a reputation. In that tension between the lamp's fire that left the soot and the dull reflection of outlined eyes lived an uncomfortable truth. That many times, to be seen, women had to transform into shadows. And in those shadows, ultimately they found their most powerful way to resist, to dominate, to exist. Beauty amulets, relics, and superstition. In the medieval world, where science was just beginning to rise from the ashes of superstition, where the inexplicable was accepted with resignation and fought with symbols, prayers, and enchantments, the human body was more than a structure of flesh and bone. It was a spiritual battleground, a vessel that could be possessed by invisible forces, protected by sacred objects, or transformed through ritual acts. And among all possible targets of that mystical intervention, one of the most coveted was beauty. But not just any beauty, one that did not depend on care, makeup, blood, or genetics, but on the intangible. A beauty that descended, literally, from the heavens or the beyond. Hence, one of the strangest and least documented customs of the time was born. The use of magical amulets, holy relics, and superstitious fragments to attract, preserve, or amplify physical beauty. These objects, as varied as they were absurd to our modern eyes, were used by women, and in some cases by men, who believed that appearance could be improved not by earthly means, but through spiritual mediation. Amulets hung around the neck, small bones sewn into underwear, reliquaries hidden in dressing chests, tiny bottles with saints' teeth, locks of hair from martyrs, dried tears of virgins depicted in icons. All these elements formed part of the secret universe of supernatural beautification. One of the most common amulets, though with an infinite variety of shapes, was called the Mirror of Grace. It was not a real mirror, but a small polished metal object, usually made of silver or tin, inscribed with a prayer, a psalm fragment, or a protective rune. It was said that wearing it close to the heart made the face radiate a special light, the eyes gain clarity, and skin blemishes slowly disappear. Some versions of these amulets included dried drops of holy water or wax from candles used during a funeral mass. This blend of the sacred and the mortuary was part of the charm, beauty born from closeness to the eternal. Even more disturbing was the use of bone fragments or human remains. Many women, especially from noble families, wore small fabric pouches around their waist containing tiny relics, saints' teeth, coffin splinters, dust from sacred skulls. It was believed that daily contact with these remains, especially during the first hours of the day, had the power to preserve the youthfulness of the skin. Some instructions indicated that they should be stroked with the right hand before combing hair or applying makeup, as a way to activate their energy. In other cases, amulets were linked to astrology. Stones associated with Venus, such as jade, amber, or red coral, were used, and small talismans engraved with planetary symbols and specific geometric figures were prepared. The talisman was kept near the chest or submerged in water overnight, and then the face was washed with that same water at dawn. The goal was to impregnate the skin with the energy of the stars, harmonize the body's fluids, and attract favorable glances from others. It was said that this ritual had to be performed only on specific days of the month, when the moon was in its waxing crescent phase, and never during eclipses or storms, for fear of disrupting its effect. One of the most striking, and undoubtedly most bizarre practices, was carrying the nails of a woman who had died young and beautiful. These nails, carefully extracted and treated with scented oils, were sewn inside the corset or placed inside a pouch filled with dried petals. It was believed that the remains of a young deceased woman could transfer her incomplete beauty to the wearer, as if the interrupted essence of her body could be completed in another woman's body. The fact that many of these nails were obtained clandestinely or even stolen from recent corpses did not seem to matter. On the contrary, the more recent the death, the stronger the effect. No less unsettling were the so-called charm rings, iron or bronze bands inscribed with words in Latin, Greek, or unknown languages, probably invented by the makers themselves. These rings were not worn on fingers but tied to the hair, ankles, or hidden in folds of clothing. It was said they had to be activated by quietly reciting a phrase in front of the fire just before dawn, and their power increased if the wearer fasted for 3 days. Although there is no evidence that these practices caused any change in appearance, many women swore by their effectiveness and, in some cases, refused to go out in public without them. Beauty amulets were not simple superstitions without structure. Many followed recipes collected in grimoires, books of female secrets, and medieval medical treatises. Some of these texts, often written by nuns, doctors, or herbalists, mixed botanical knowledge with elements of sympathetic magic, astrology, and religion. For example, it was recommended to mix swallowbone powder with blessed rose petals to obtain a lotion that restored the glow of youth, or to gather the morning dew on the first day of spring to wash the face, thus ensuring clear skin throughout the year. What is fascinating about this universe is that, although it may seem absurd to us, it was not perceived as irrational by its practitioners. It was part of a coherent logic in which the visible and the invisible were deeply intertwined. Beauty was not only a matter of proportions or physical care, but a manifestation of the soul, of the energies flowing through the body, of the will of God or the stars. And if those forces could be channeled through an object, then it was logical to protect it, respect it, carry it, sleep with it under the pillow. Some women even requested that their favorite amulets be buried with them. Graves have been found containing small reliquaries, velvet pouches with foreign hairs, stones engraved with Venusian signs, bone fragments placed near the heart. These objects, though invisible during life, accompanied the body in death, as if their function did not end with visible beauty, but transcended to the beyond, as if the soul too needed adornments. In the end, these beauty amulets were a mirror of the era, a reflection of the deepest fears, hopes, and beliefs of those who used them. They were not just accessories, but material testimonies of a way of understanding the world in which everything, faith, flesh, death, could be manipulated, influenced, redirected by something as small as a ring, a splinter, or a forgotten bone. And in that world where makeup could cause blindness, baths were avoided as illness, and eyebrows were made with mouse skin. Perhaps it is not so strange that beauty was also sought in the invisible, in the sacred, in what lies beyond logic and reason. Because sometimes, the most disturbing thing is not the amulet itself, but the quiet desperation with which a person clings to the idea that their worth, their entire existence, can rest on an object that does not breathe, but promises to make them shine. Funeral beauty, preparing to die. Beautiful. In the somber silence of a medieval room, lit by the flickering flame of a tallow candle, a woman gazed at herself in a polished metal mirror, not to celebrate the life she had left, but to prepare for the approaching death. In that Europe trapped between plagues, endless wars, and heavenly judgments, death was an everyday certainty. But more than a feared end, it was an event to be met with dignity, and in certain circles, even with aesthetic grace. Yes, even in dying, A woman was judged by her appearance. From this idea arose a practice as touching as it was puzzling. Funeral beauty, a meticulous ritual intended to ensure that the body, and especially the face, would be presented to the world, and perhaps to God, in its most perfect form. The belief that the body should maintain a serene, almost celestial appearance at the moment of death was fueled by depictions of saints, virgins, and martyrs who, in altarpieces and illuminated manuscripts, died with lips closed in a faint smile and skin as immaculate as alabaster statues. That iconography shaped social expectations. Dying could not be a wild, decomposed act. Not for women, at least. The good death had to be beautiful, and for that, many prepared with the same dedication a bride would for her wedding night. There are testimonies revealing how noble ladies and even women of the middle classes with some religious education kept funeral chests among their most intimate belongings. These were not coffins or relics. They were small chests containing their burial clothes, special combs, reserved perfumes, and in some cases, written instructions for whoever would dress and arrange them once their soul had departed. The fabrics were chosen in advance: fine linen, velvet, or silk in soft colors, white, pale blue, ivory, which symbolized purity and surrender. No strong colors or heavy brocades, because death required a light, translucent, almost ethereal aesthetic. But it was not just about the clothes. The face had to be worked on patiently. Some women applied ointments and masks during the nights, not to attract living gazes, but to prepare the skin that would be seen one last time by the community, the priest, the relatives. A face without blemishes, without signs of pain, that could be shown without shame. In some convents, nuns learned to treat their own features before the mirror as an act of humility and faith, convinced that the face they showed at death would be the same one presented at the final judgment. In certain regions of northern Italy, the practice became institutionalized. There were specialized women, called in the local dialect adornatrici dell'addio, whose sole job was to prepare female corpses for display. They were not simple body washers. They were death beauticians. Their work included combing, applying makeup with mineral powders, adjusting clothes so they would not reveal the stiffness of the body, discreetly perfuming the temples, placing the hands in a serene prayer position, and in some cases, applying small wax beads under the eyelids so the closed eyes would not sink as hours passed. For many families, these women were as important as priests, because a beautified body was a body worthy of sincere tears, prayer, and memory. A neglected body, on the other hand, could be read as a sign of sin, despair, or spiritual abandonment. In a time when the soul was inseparable from its physical shell, the corpse was, paradoxically, a living message. The upper classes took the custom even further. Some ladies had their portraits painted while alive wearing the dress they would use for their burial. These portraits, known as imago mortis or farewell likeness, were not sad or dark works. They showed the woman seated with a serene expression, dressed in white, hair braided symmetrically, and hands holding a rosary. In some cases, the background included funerary details: a skull, an hourglass, or a bouquet of withered flowers. It was a way of taming death, making it part of everyday life. Beauty was not to die with life, but to accompany it until the end. But there was also a background of fear. Women believed, and preachers reinforced this idea, that dying disorderly was a sign of a disordered soul, that the devil could be confused and drag with him anyone who looked dirty, disheveled, or angry at death. The physical state of the corpse was seen as a reflection of the spiritual state of the soul. That is why hurried confessions, ritual baths with purifying herbs, and whispered prayers were made while someone anointed the wrists with myrrh oil or combed the still warm hair. Because dying well was literally a way of saving oneself. Some practices were so specific that today they would seem like ritual theater scenes. Some placed lily petals under their tongue to ensure fresh breath in the tomb. Others hid fragments of love letters, small pearls, even pieces of blessed bread in their chests, as if these objects could protect them from oblivion. A 15th century French lady requested to be buried with her fingers stained red with poppy juice, so they would look still alive in rest. Another left instructions to paint her cheeks with a mixture of coral powder and goat milk, ensuring that she would look asleep, not defeated. All this might seem obsessive or futile, but it was not for those who practiced it. Death was not a collapse of the body, but a transformation. And to cross that threshold, a special kind of presentation was needed. The woman who died had to appear dignified, beautiful, at peace. Because that image would be imprinted in the memory of the living, in portraits, in family chronicles, and perhaps in some dimension beyond the veil, in the eyes of the Creator. Over time, the custom declined. Modernity brought hospitals, professional embalmers, and the progressive separation between body and soul. But in some rural villages, traces of this practice persisted until the 19th century. Elderly women who died wearing dresses prepared decades before, young women requesting a last rosewater bath before being laid out, mothers arranging the hair of their dead daughters as if they were to be married. Today, in an age where death has been pushed to the margins, hidden behind operating rooms and closed coffins, this ancient custom resonates with an almost uncomfortable intensity, because it reveals something we prefer to ignore, that the desire for beauty does not disappear with life, that even facing the most absolute end, we still cling to a form of appearance, of meaning, of aesthetics. And perhaps, among all the strange practices we have explored, the mouse eyebrows, the corpse perfumes, the poisonous makeup, this is the most deeply human. Not the most absurd, nor the most dangerous, but the most intimate. Because it speaks of the desire to be remembered not as what we were, but as what we wanted to be. To depart, yes, but leaving behind the image of a serene face, one last beauty, destined not to attract, but to endure. Silence as an attraction, vocal mutilations. There is a stillness that is not peace, an absence of sound that does not come from the desire to listen, but from imposition. In the dark history of beauty, among the shadows of what was admired, forced, and distorted, hides a practice that, although rarely named, leaves a chilling mark on those who dare to observe it: the mutilation of the female voice. A punishment, yes, but also, and even more disturbing, an aesthetic ideal, a form of control cloaked in virtue. Because there was a time when silence was not only a sign of obedience, but an attribute of beauty. And under that premise, acts were justified that today would seem unthinkable to us. The voice of a woman, in certain periods of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, was considered a double-edged weapon. It could seduce, lie, tempt, provoke. A high-pitched tone, an excessively emotional voice, free laughter, or an unexpected word were seen as signs of a disorderly nature. Hence, the most exalted qualities in a lady were reserve, temperance, and above all, silence. But that silence was not always a choice. In some environments, it became a physical imposition, a symbolic mutilation of language, and even, although scarcely documented and surrounded by institutional silence, a literal mutilation. The history of these practices is not abundant in records, precisely because the bodies of silenced women left few traces outside convents, houses of discipline, and courts. But there are indications, scattered fragments in medical manuals, private letters, and ecclesiastical treatises pointing to a disturbing reality. Some women were subjected to procedures intended to damage, alter, or limit their vocal capacity, all in the name of virtue and beauty. The voice had to be low, muted, almost whispered. A woman who spoke loudly was seen as a creature overwhelmed by the earthly. The one who barely emitted a murmur, on the other hand, was perceived as delicate, refined, ideal. In certain convents, particularly in regions of Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, young novices were taught to restrict their voice through physical exercises. They were instructed to tighten the throat, speak with the mouth half closed, or directly keep entire days of absolute silence. It was believed that this training changed not only the character, but also the tone of the voice, tuning it until it became an almost inaudible thread. What is unsettling is that these practices were not limited to the spiritual realm. In some noble families, girls were prepared in the same way, with the idea that a silent woman would have more value in the marriage market. The instructions leaked into books on female education, which read that the word that is not heard is more beautiful than the one that is spoken. But some took the idea much further. In rare documents, including certain inquisitorial records and medical chronicles from the late Middle Ages, cases appear where the voice was definitively silenced. Women whose tongues were partially cut, not as punishment for witchcraft, but as a preventive method, under the pretext of avoiding murmuring, blasphemy, or the temptation of profane singing. Others, it is said, were subjected to cauterization of the vocal cords by hot irons applied from inside the mouth. The procedure left only a barely perceptible buzzing as a residue of their ability to speak. They were not witches. They were not criminals. They were women who, because of their proximity to power or their early rebelliousness, were molded as living statues of obedience. There is one especially disturbing case, mentioned in a letter from a Florentine doctor of the 15th century, describing a young noblewoman whose mother, obsessed with the virtues of modesty and divine beauty, ordered that her daughter be treated with a mixture of caustics based on lime and vinegar to softly damage her vocal cords. The procedure, although it did not leave her mute, reduced her voice to a fragile, broken whisper. The result was celebrated by the family as a success. "Now she speaks like an angel," wrote the doctor, "and no one else will hear in her the fury of the world." These acts, terrible in their execution, had a perverse logic: to transform the female body into an object of contemplation, not dialogue. Silence turned the woman into a pure, immaculate, untouchable presence. If she did not speak, she could not contradict, could not negotiate, could not suggest desire. She was an ideal figure, an image, and that image, as so many others in the history of the female body, was more important than the life inhabiting it. In some artistic circles of the time, this fascination with female silence translated into works where women were depicted with closed lips, downcast eyes, hands on their laps. Beauty was associated with passivity. The word, and even more the tone, was a threat. And so, in some courts, young women were trained to laugh without sound, to cry without sobbing, to express emotion only with their gaze. It was a contained, tamed beauty, one that should not vibrate, resonate, or alter the space. And yet, in that oppression, in that attempt to erase the voice, secret forms of resistance arose. Some women, aware of their situation, learned to write in codes, to communicate through complex gestures, to use the gaze as a form of language. In convents, nuns who took vows of absolute silence developed communication systems as sophisticated as those of an army. Beauty, then, also became a mask, a disguise, a survival strategy. What is most unsettling when looking back is not the brutality of the methods, although that brutality was real, but the social acceptance surrounding them. Silencing a woman was not seen as a crime, but as a form of perfection. And that forces us to rethink everything we thought we understood about the beauty ideals of that era. Because it was not just about the face, the hair, the skin, also about the tone, the word, the volume. The body had to be beautiful, but the voice, if it could be silenced. Had to be. The history of imposed silence is one of the most invisible from the past. It left no grand monuments, no epic battles, no anthems. Only whispers, muted echoes, fragments of incomplete biographies. But it remains there, in the seams of the story, in the letters where women ask for permission to speak, in the portraits where their mouths are painted closed, in the ruins of convents, where they learn to be silent before they learn to live. And so we close this journey with the most disturbing image of all, that of a woman who was raised to be beautiful, not for what she said, but for what she would never say. A perfect body, shaped by foreign hands, crowned by silence. A silence so deep, so irreversible, that it still resonates in history as a scream that never broke the surface. If this journey shook you as much as it did me, subscribe and leave your like to continue exploring what history would rather forget. Share this video with someone who still believes the past was simpler. Thank you for joining me today. Good night.